My British Empire. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 1 Coming to England. 1546, October 18th. The weather was cloudy and rainy. It's almost the 5th year, and the weather here is still so unbearable. I'm already 9 years old, my god. How many years will it take me to grow up? Zhang Zihe wrote the diary viciously with his white and tender little hands. The little finger exhausted all his strength, and the slender quill was too difficult to grasp. It was very difficult for a child like him. The slender fonts on the paper are sorted from left to right, and a script that is very different from the Latin alphabet that is popular today is spread on the paper. It is neither English nor French as prescribed by England, Your Highness. It's time for lunch. A young woman dressed in a maid's attire rushed over with small steps, panting slightly. Well, I see. Zhang Zihe reluctantly agreed. As we all know, British cuisine is notoriously unpalatable in the world. Even as a prince, the food is not much better. Zhang Zihe closed the diary and hid it under the pillow. This is also a kind of deception. Jumping off the bed, Zhang Zihe followed the maid to the restaurant with short legs. After passing through a long corridor, the ground is covered with a mahogany floor, and the walls on both sides are covered with portraits of people, each of whom is mighty and extraordinary. Of course, God, the old man and his son are also on it, looking extraordinarily kind and pleasing to the eye. After 5 years, Zhang Zihe has watched it countless times, and he is tired of looking at God. Ignoring the salutations of the maids on both sides, I walked towards the restaurant. Squeak. The maid pushed open the door, only to see a middle-aged man dressed in a large number of gold ornaments, sitting on the right seat of the long table with his belly upright, staring at Zhang Zihe, who came in, with a majestic face. Immediately the smile broke. Edward. Come on, today I have your favorite roast lamb, cooked according to the method you said. Who would have thought that His Majesty the King, who is so majestic outside, would have such a side? But Zhang Zihe got used to it. Oh, to be exact, Edward got used to it. Who told him that he was the only male heir of the entire Tudor royal family, and also the youngest heir of Henry VIII's old age? At the age of 46, sitting on the other side was Edward's stepmother, Henry VIII's sixth queen, Catherine Parr. The queen was sitting upright, and when she saw Edward, she smiled at him. Edward, sit down, it's time to start. Catherine has no children so far, so she has always been kind to Edward. Henry VIII was born in 1491. The second Tudor king and Lord of Ireland. It was only in 1537 that there was a male heir, who was very precious. He was named Duke of Cornwall and Earl of Chester shortly after Edward was born. The Prince of Wales was Princess Mary at the time and let his 2 daughters act as nannies to take good care of him, from which it can be seen that he is definitely a patriarchal king. However, Edward said he liked it. Edward sat next to His Majesty the King, and he dined meticulously with a royal etiquette. Even though he was favored by the king, he did not dare to break the rules, because there was a fat woman next to him staring at him. The fat woman was the maid of his mother, Jane Seymour, and now the chief maid of the royal family. Her name was Anne Swell, a very strict old woman who had watched his mother and Edward grow up since she was a child. Edward had a headache when he saw her, but he couldn't have an attack, so he could only draw a circle and curse her for being constipated. There are several plates of roast goose and a pot of roast lamb on the long dining table, exuding a yellow and seductive atmosphere. This was also a rare enjoyment for the nobles in the Middle Ages. After all, the popular food method at that time was nothing more than stewing in a large pot with various spices. Barbecue is also directly grilled, which is a test of the chef's cooking skills. The average nobleman cannot enjoy this dish. Fortunately, the chef owned by the English royal family is very good. Within a few days after listening to Edward's explanation, the roast lamb was almost done. So the whole royal family liked this dish, and it was served every few days, and Edward almost vomited. Fortunately, after the religious reform, the royal family of England confiscated a large amount of church property, and their income was very rich, so it was nothing to eat some lamb. Compared with the hard-working French royal family, it's not bad. After lunch, when she said goodbye as usual, Princess Elizabeth, who was sitting upright as a lady, asked suddenly, Edward, how have you been riding recently? It's okay. You can already run on horseback. Oh. Then let me check it out. Because Edward was in poor health since he was a child, Zhang Zihe began to practice riding to exercise himself when he first traveled through time. After 5 years of hard practice, I finally changed from a sick sprout that got sick after walking a few steps to a sprout that can run freely. It may be due to the nature of the disease. From birth to now, Edward has had a small illness every 3 days and a serious illness every 5 days, so the ambitious Edward has been exercising regularly, and he has lived strong until now. Henry VIII's patriarchal patriarchy is very serious. Edward can do whatever he wants, and Elizabeth has been required to learn the etiquette of ladies, and even her favorite horse riding is not often played. Therefore, the important task of testing Edward's riding skills became Elizabeth's happy time. Princess Mary on the other side seemed to have not heard it, and she still drank the turbid soup without making a sound, showing her ladylike demeanor. Henry VIII nodded slightly, and Princess Elizabeth saluted immediately, followed Edward slowly out of the restaurant, and her gentle footsteps could not conceal Elizabeth's joyful mood. As soon as the door of the gorgeous restaurant was closed, Princess Elizabeth jumped forward and switched positions. Edward shook his head helplessly, with a disappointed expression. Her Royal Highness, who was always paying attention to Edward, frowned, immediately turned around, stood in front of Edward, and squatted down. "Hey, Edward, do you have a problem with me?" Seeing that his sister's tone couldn't be truthful, Edward hurriedly changed the subject. "Sister, your riding skills can now be compared with knights." Hearing about his most proud riding skills, he immediately forgot to condemn Edward, and he couldn't help saying proudly, "That's right. Ordinary knights are no match for me," and Uncle Hughes praised me. Uncle Hughes is the head of the royal family's bodyguard, and he also taught Edward's riding skills. Hughes Smith, the second son of a baron, stood out in a riot to wipe out the border nobles. He killed 3 knights in a row and captured a viscount, so Henry VIII was named a court baron and owned 3 manors, which is not bad compared to ordinary wandering knights. This is my first time writing a book. The writing style is immature, please forgive me. Chapter 2. Baron Hughes Smith. Hughes Smith is a serious man in his 30s, with scars all over his body, and his big muscles look very mighty. He has long gray-silver hair, and a pair of light blue eyes shining brightly under thick eyebrows. The weather-beaten cheeks look even more handsome in the cold wind. A proper middle-aged handsome guy. Edward followed Elizabeth out of the Eschery Palace slowly, and the 2 little maids beside him hurried to the stables, leading Edward's beloved pony to follow. Foals are warm-blooded cabards, a popular breed in England in the 16th century suitable for long-distance running. It belongs to the late-blooming type of horse. It originated from the Caucasus horse breed in the northern part of Eurasia. The adult horse weighs 950 pounds. It is a small horse in size. Of course, compared with Europe, they are very hard-working and known for their long-distance endurance. The foal was named Arthur by Edward. Riding a great monarch in the history of England is indeed a great feeling, especially this king often changes gender. Men and women do not know, of course. His Royal Highness may have forgotten that his father's elder brother is also called Arthur. Arthur has snow white hair, combed by the maid so that it shines white. Very beautiful. Arthur, who was more than 1 year old, was very happy to be able to go out for a walk, and ran to Edward's side briskly with his pony head held high, biting his sleeves. Okay. I know you're panicking, didn't this bring you out? The little pony seemed to understand, biting much less forcefully, but still rubbing with his small dam. Well, I'll take you for a walk 3 times a week, outside the palace. Edward made a promise in desperation. Only after this did Edward get away, and Princess Elizabeth was stopping to watch Edward's embarrassment with great interest, discussing with the maids from time to time, and there was a burst of cheerful laughter. Edward's older sister, Princess Elizabeth, was born at Pressency Palace in London, England. She was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and his second queen, Anne Boleyn. Since her parents were married according to Protestant rules, the Catholic Church considered her an illegitimate daughter. She was designated at birth as heir to the throne, and her half-sister, Mary, was the unlucky servant to her. Just as Edward was born, she and Princess Mary became Edward's nanny. When Elizabeth was 3, her mother was executed for treason, and a year later Henry VIII and his third queen, Jane Seymour, had a boy, Edward. Both Elizabeth and Mary became Edward's servants. Elizabeth was born in 1533 and was 4 years older than Edward. Due to their similar age, her relationship with Edward was very close, and her relationship with her sister, Princess Mary, was not salty. The 2 of them came to the school grounds of the royal palace in a fight along the way. At this time, Baron Smith was training dozens of young boys in their teens. These newly joined boys are being tortured by the Baron, but fortunately, the Baron's preferences are normal. The Baron stared at them with a serious face as they practiced sprinting on horseback. Under the Baron's strict training, The boys tensed up and didn't make a sound in view of Baron Smith's bravery. Henry VIII appointed him as the chief of the court guard, commanding 500 court guards. This is also all the armed forces of the entire royal family, the standing army of armed forces. Therefore, under normal circumstances, the Baron will come to train those young people who have just joined. And he was very fond of torturing the new boys, and this rumor was widely circulated. The result of this is that the newcomers are basically quiet and have no thorns, so the Baron no longer clarifies. They are composed of the second sons of some nobles except the eldest son. They come with their own horses and armor weapons to serve His Majesty the King, expecting to gain meritorious service in the war and win the fiefdom according to the rules of the Middle Ages. The nobles are loyal to the canonized nobles, and the iron law that a vassal's vassal is not my vassal is popular, and the vassals have to lead the army to fight during the war, so the king does not have a permanent army, and even the king cannot afford it. During the Middle Ages, the king and the nobles jointly managed the country. The king entrusted the big nobles in various places, and the nobles must be loyal to the king, and the big nobles entrusted the small nobles, layer by layer, thus forming the ruling foundation of the entire country. In the Middle Ages, the order of nobility is as follows: knight, baron, viscount, earl, duke, king. This is the ruling power of the entire England. In theory, knights have the same status as the king, and the king is just a great nobleman. Of course, this is also in theory. Everyone found out. Why is there no marquis, bago, county, principality, duchy and marquis, margravate? These feudal systems began in the period of Charles the Hammer, the palace minister of the Frankish kingdom. The titles of the Frankish country were originally non-descent, but after the demise of the Carolingian dynasty, the local nobles who supported their own troops took the opportunity to separate one side and develop the hereditary system, forming the later state within a state. The centralization of early Germany was maintained, and their duchies came very late. The hereditary system, the most common one in the Middle Ages, was the Earl country. The Count Earl originally referred to the right-hand man of the Germanic kings, who was entrusted to guard one side of the local governor. These local governors combined judicial, military, and taxation powers, and gradually formed the Earl. The feudal class was given a lot of power when it was entrusted, and it also became the high level in the feudal system. The area that was enfeoffed was called bowling, which can be initially compared to the Jiddashi of the Tang dynasty in China. After the disintegration of the kingdom, they supported their own troops and established an independent uncle country in the United Kingdom. The title of Duke was born after Edward III, and it was used to confer on princes. In fact, it is the same as the Earl country, but it means a slightly higher status. In addition, countries in Eastern and Southern Europe were greatly influenced by the Holy Roman Empire, and many of their local leaders were also called duchies because of the duke title bestowed by the emperor. The rank of the duke is second only to the prince, and the territory governed by the duke is called the duchy. The duchy has greater power. The duke exercises judicial arbitration and taxation powers on its own land, while retaining its own army. The duke can continue to entrust smaller lords, such as viscounts and barons. Principalities, uncle states, and marquis states were all directly entrusted by the king. In fact, sovereignty changed with the power of the emperor. Just like the vassal states in the Eastern Zhou dynasty, later viscounts and barons were too small to call themselves states. The concept of marquis is generally found in Germany, which refers to the borders where there are frequent battles. For this reason, a marquis military zone is specially set up there. The leader of the marquis is the marquis. Landenberg, later formed Prussia, and Austrian borderlands, German for Eastern borderlands, which later became the base of the Habsburg family in other feudal countries. The title of marquis occasionally appeared later, but it was generally used as a supplement and rarely distributed. To put it simply, in fact, the marquis generally refers to the earl of the border district. Because of the tense fighting in the border area, their status was unusual, so they were promoted to marquis. Because it is a border area, the number of earls is naturally less than usual. Of course, there are other reasons, but this is an important one. Back to the topic. There is another point that Henry VIII is a very successful king. He almost spent his king's career in war, so there is a good chance to get meritorious service by his side. Chapter 3: The Future Earl of Leicester. Dozens of aristocratic youths carried out Baron Smith's orders meticulously. The youths tightly pressed their lips together, allowing the sweat to flow freely from their foreheads. Teenagers know that practicing sweat at this time is a straw that may save your life at any time. The arrival of Edward and Elizabeth did not disturb the training of the teenagers at all, and they also consciously stood aside, admiring the training of the teenagers. After a while, seeing that Smith and the others had no intention of stopping, Edward shook his head boredly, his eyes wandering around unconsciously. Immediately, he saw that his sister's eyes were not right, and she kept staring at a black-haired boy. The girl is also at the age of spring, but this guy is not very handsome. Do you want to think about it? Edward unconsciously thought of his sister. Robert Dudley was the fifth son of John Dudley, Earl of Warwick. Because I liked mathematics, I went to the royal family to study and learn writing skills. By the way, it is rumored that before Elizabeth I came to power, Robert Dudley was her good friend. The two had known each other since childhood, and they were even imprisoned in the Tower of London together. When Elizabeth I learned that she had become queen, she immediately appointed Robert as the royal horse officer, responsible for all the Queen's large ceremonies, in charge of all the dogs and horses of the royal family, and gave him the title of Lord. The next year legend has it that Elizabeth I had many lovers, but her favorite was Robert Dudley. And Robert also knows the reason why Elizabeth did not have a family. The failed marriage of her parents and the marriage of her sister Mary I cast too much shadow on her when she was young. However, Robert still served Elizabeth I for life. He always believed that if there must be a husband, it must be me. Robert was married many times, and Queen Elizabeth was angry about it, but the result was always forgiven. Later, for some political purposes, Elizabeth I named Robert the Earl of Leicester, and wanted him to marry Mary Stuart, the widowed Queen of Scots at the time, but Robert refused. Robert died in Cornbury Manor in 1588. After hearing the bad news, the Queen seemed to have lost her soul. She locked herself in the room without eating or drinking for a long time, and was finally rescued by the ministers due to some political reasons and Elizabeth's own psychological reasons. Queen Elizabeth has never been married. While most people still think that Robert Dudley is mainly responsible, Tudor supporters have always classified him as a sinner. Edward shuddered at the thought that he might be childless. However, I have been sick all the time in my previous life, so I'm afraid I'm powerless. It shouldn't be a problem with my fertility. Edward immediately comforted himself. I'm no longer a weak chicken like my previous life. Travelers won't be so unlucky. Edward thought a lot, but the real time only passed for a while. Should I break them up? Edward became concerned about his sister again. Forget it. I shouldn't die early. Let nature take its course. After half an hour, the teenagers dispersed all of a sudden, rushing towards Edward and the others like a tide, competing to salute Edward and Elizabeth as knights. As expected, it won't be long before Edward is the object of their allegiance. Henry VIII's physical condition is a secret to others, but it should not be too easy for them as guards. Edward had no aversion to the fawning of the guards. He greeted each of them with a smile, with a sincere smile on his face. It is very necessary for the guards to make friends with a future king, and the prince's smile is the best response to their behavior. Elizabeth felt that her younger brother gave people a special feeling now, as if her father greeted a minister, full of confidence and calmness, and responded to all kinds of greetings with ease. It seemed that the younger brother who often teased her had grown up all of a sudden, and a feeling of joy and worry lingered in her heart, which made Elizabeth at a loss. After dismissing the curiosity of the guards, Edward came directly to Baron Smith and stopped the Baron from saluting. Mr. Baron, can I write Arthur to practice with you today? You agreed yesterday. Edward said in a proud tone, with a look of anticipation on his face. Of course. Iron Man Smith, will do what I say. Smith made a firm promise, but why did he have a helpless tone knowing that the Baron is worried about his health? Uncle Smith, you know my recent physical condition, and it is almost the same as Robert's. Although I know that Edward is bragging, it is indeed not the same as before. Professor William, it's only a little bit close as the name suggests. The professor is the thinnest boy among the guards, William Walpole, so he got an elegant nickname. Of course, it's an insulting term for a group of would-be knights dedicated to merit. Afterwards, Smith coughed, and all the teenagers immediately focused their attention. All knights, practice more now, and I will check later. Smith said in a slightly stern tone. Yes, Master Smith. The teenagers assured loudly. Smith led the way ahead, walking step by step with a rattling sound, which was the sound of the chain mail shaking on his body. Smith is a rigorous person, and he usually wears his armor and his hand with a knife, riding on a little pony Arthur. He is a veritable Prince Charming. Edward was very happy to leave Hampton Court Palace. After all, he lived for 5 years, and of course, if he added the 4 years before him, it would be 9 years. The same was true for Elizabeth. She had witnessed her mother's tragic death since she was a child, and she didn't have a good impression of Hampton Court Palace. Leaving Hampton Court Palace would make her feel a lot easier. Hampton Court Palace is known as the British Versailles Palace, a model of the British Tudor Palace. Cardinal Wolsey purchased this area in 1514, and construction began in 1515. The palace was built completely in Tudor style, with 1,280 rooms inside, which was the most magnificent building in the country at that time. Later, Wolsey attracted the dissatisfaction of the king because of his wealth, and after his death in 1530, the palace was owned by Henry VIII. Henry VIII and Anne Pauline moved into this palace and began to expand it. King Edward I of England was born here. It is said that Elizabeth I used this place as a love nest to avoid the eyes and ears of Congress. Chapter 4 Royal Horse Galloping. As far as the eye can see, a small grassland with more than 1,000 acres lies horizontally on the north bank of the Thames. The Thames River, which has not been influenced by industry, is still clear and cold, with the gentleness and smallness of the rivers of island countries. Of course, this is compared with China. For those who have seen the Yangtze River, this is a small river. For Smith, who lives in London, this is the big river. It is the largest river he has seen since he left Buckinghamshire. Even though he has seen it countless times, Smith is still in awe of it. Wait, why doesn't His Royal Highness Prince Edward look surprised? Had he seen the Great Thames? But didn't His Majesty the King worry about the safety of the prince and never let him come to the Thames River? I'm not even on the river this time, it's miles away. Forget it, maybe he ran out secretly. Edward didn't expect that some of his expressions would give Smith such a big association. He was thinking about how to protect this draft river for Londoners in the future. The pasture was only 5 miles from Hampton Court Palace, so close that Henry VIII forbade Edward from going to the river. 1 mile equals 1.6 kilometers, and 5 miles equals 8 kilometers. 5 miles was no problem for Smith, but it was very difficult for Edward and Elizabeth, so Smith and Edward rode there. He loved his big black horse named Iron Shield very much, and he was usually reluctant to ride it. He was more precious than his precious son today. He had to ride it, and Baron Smith's heart trembled, for fear that the stones on the roadside would damage the horse's hooves. As for why Baron Smith loves the big black horse called Shield so much, Edward had heard rumors that the black horse had saved Baron Smith's life by parrying an arrow on the battlefield. Therefore, the Smith knight at that time thought that this was the meaning of God, and the shield became the messenger of God. After spending all his savings, and maybe God blessed him, the dark horse was saved. So, the 15-year-old horse was ridden by Smith to the pasture. Edward and Elizabeth rode their respective horses to the meadow. Edward's Arthur was white, and Elizabeth's horse was reddish-brown. One could tell they were sons of aristocrats, so some serfs and yeomen on the side of the road hurried out of the way for a fear of being accidentally injured. At the end of the Middle Ages, no one complained about being accidentally injured by nobles. The former civilian college students now also feel the demeanor of what is called a privileged class. Although he didn't like this kind of behavior from the bottom of his heart, but he was asked to apologize to those serfs and poor people. Edward said that the concubine couldn't do it. Edward didn't realize that after 5 years of aristocratic education, his thinking has unknowingly turned to the aristocratic class. This is why the ass determines the head. Although Edward still retains the previously accepted idea of equality for all, at the end of the Middle Ages, it is a ridiculous fantasy to want to achieve equality for all. There must always be a dream in life to chase. Therefore, Edward rode on the horse, thinking about how his body could become like that of ordinary people, so that he could ride the horse and whip at any time, and gallop in this kingdom of his own. Elizabeth, what is your dream? Edward turned to his sister and asked. Dream, let me think about it again. Elizabeth lowered her head cutely. Her eyes kept rolling. Edward looked at the little lolly riding on the horse with a funny face. The long white dress made Elizabeth's little face more rosy and lovely. 13-year-old Elizabeth was in the prime of her life. In ancient Chinese terms, it was the prime of life. Sitting on a horse, she was a head taller than Edward, which made Edward's neck sore. Just half an hour later, Edward suddenly felt a fiery emotion spreading from the inside of his thigh, and Arthur shook from time to time. This feeling was very sour. How could it be a cool word? Just when Edward was very embarrassed, the clear sky suddenly turned cloudy, and a dark cloud rushed here, as if he was about to do something unspeakable. Edward secretly breathed a sigh of relief, and immediately sat up again, and said in an anxious tone, "Uncle Smith, it looks like the weather is going to rain. Let's go back on horseback." Smith raised his head and glanced at the dark clouds above his head, and said in a slightly joyful tone, "And, Your Highness, you and Your Highness go back quickly, my queen. Okay. Be careful." Edward then asked Elizabeth, who was thinking about her dream, "Elizabeth, let's go back." "Oh, Elizabeth responded without distraction. What? I haven't played enough. Elizabeth immediately regretted it after realizing it. The 13-year-old girl was just at the time of being lively and restless, and she finally came out to ride a horse for a while. How could she leave so easily? Why don't we ride back in a horse race? If I get to Hampton Court Palace first, you can plead with my father so that I don't have to learn etiquette from my mother today. Elizabeth switched her strategy because Edward is favored by Henry VIII. Edward has never been scolded by Henry VIII, so some troubles are blamed on him, and basically everything he asks can be passed. He is the only male in the entire Tudor royal family. What about the heir? Okay. But it's only this time, don't make another example. Edward agreed after thinking for a while. Well, yes. Elizabeth responded with a happy smile. Although Edward could ask Henry VIII to do many things, he cherished such an opportunity very much. Because he knew that Henry VIII was very busy with a religious reform, and his health was not good recently, so he didn't dare to trouble him for some trivial matters. It can be seen that Elizabeth dislikes Mother Mary, who taught her noble etiquette. Edward shivered when he thought of Mother Mary. Sister Mary is a nun at the Priory Abbey in London, a monastery where the Tudor royal family often donates gold coins, so she sent Mary Grey with the best etiquette to teach Princess Elizabeth etiquette. Mary Grey was the daughter of a baronet and was sent to a convent as a child. I don't know if I have been hurt in any way, and I have a cold face all day long. He was close to 1.7 meters tall, with a high nose, dark blue eyes, and grayish-white color on his thin cheeks. The sharp eyes seem to be able to see your soul, and the veins pop out of your hands, which proves that its owner is quite old. Shaking his head, he seemed to be able to throw that figure out of his brain. During Edward's memories, Elizabeth took a step ahead while he was not paying attention. When he came back to his senses, only Elizabeth's laughter was heard, but the person had long since disappeared. Edward smiled bitterly, shook his head, raised his whip, and slammed the whip hard into the air. Arthur seemed to understand what Edward meant, and ran after him with his calves. I hope you will support me a lot, and I will update a chapter every day around 6 o'clock in the future. Chapter 5. The Duke of Norfolk. When they arrived at the palace, Edward and Elizabeth were already wet, and Baron Smith was still walking slowly in the wind and rain on his precious iron shield. Of course. In the end it was Elizabeth who won, for her horse was grown, fat and strong, and much faster than Edward's colt hay. Edward, my father, please leave it to you. Princess Elizabeth arrogantly tossed her slightly curly blonde hair, with slightly protruding flower buds, proudly striding towards her room. Edward knew this was the result, but it was just to save Elizabeth from the rain. Shouldn't a brother with an adult soul take care of his sister? As soon as they arrived at the gate of the palace, Lucy and Luna, who had served Edward since childhood, rushed to the side. Look left, look right, observe carefully, as if to find something abnormal. Okay. Lucy, Luna, nothing wrong with me. Edward said helplessly. Your Highness. You haven't been sick for a day since you were a child, but you've gotten better recently. As soon as the illness was mentioned, the slightly older Luna began to talk endlessly. Edward smiled wryly in his heart, and covered his ears helplessly with his hands, while Lucy beside her mischievously blinked her eyelids and also covered her ears. Luna and Lucy are a pair of sisters, whose parents were serfs of the Tudor royal family. Because they are close to Edward's age, they were recruited by His Majesty the King as Edward's maid. Of course, being beautiful is only one of the reasons. Luna was 2 years older than Edward and 1 year older than Lucy. Both have brown hair and dark blue watery eyes. Since the two came to Edward when they were 6 years old, their barley-colored skin had gradually turned white, and their round thighs looked powerful, which was caused by their frequent work. Luna was a point taller than Lucy, and half a head taller than Edward. So as soon as Edward looked up, he saw Luna's chest trembling due to speaking. The girl's newly developed breasts were so big, like a small steamed bun, which made Edward's heart sway unconsciously. Luna seemed to notice that Edward's eyes were on her chest. She shrank back unconsciously, then straightened up again, looking at Edward with provocative eyes. If it wasn't for my immature body, I would have wanted you to look good a long time ago. Edward looked away helplessly, thinking angrily in his heart. Luna couldn't help feeling disappointed when she saw Edward's gaze averted. Although she was still young, she already knew that if her family wanted to get rid of their status as serfs, they could only rely on Edward. After looking away, Edward changed the subject. Luna, how is His Majesty the King doing today? Your Highness, His Majesty the King is doing very well today, but he is a little drowsy and just woke up. Luna replied in a resentful tone. Okay. I'm going to see my father. Edward walked towards the king's bedroom. Oh. Don't forget to feed Arthur some barley and eggs. He has worked hard today, yes. Luna and Lucy quickly responded with a salute, only to see Edward walking quickly. By the time the two got up, Edward was no longer in sight. The two sisters looked at each other, and there was a poof, and the two sisters laughed out loud, and the melodious sound echoed throughout the corridor going straight to the bedroom. The long corridor is full of elegant and expensive atmosphere. The smooth floor was painted with a reddish-brown varnish, a nautical anti-corrosion paint, which had been applied profusely, at least 3 times. As far as Edward could tell, the walls are covered with various oil paintings, including those of God and his son, as well as pictures of ancient kings in armor, all of which look extraordinarily heroic. When they came to the door of the master bedroom and saw Edward, the doorman directly opened the door and let Edward in. At this time, His Majesty the King was flipping through a Bible, looking very devout. Henry VIII received a good education since he was a child, and the poet Skelton was his teacher. When he was a little longer, he met and consulted Erasmus and some Renaissance celebrities. He knows Latin, French, Italian and some Spanish, Greek, loves poetry and music, and can compose and play. In the early years of Henry VIII's reign, some of his actions showed the influence of the new trend of thought of the Renaissance. He praised Collet, a humanist who was erudite and vigorously attacked the corruption of the church and the ignorance of priests. As my Dr. Henry VIII was also extremely learned, and his court was a center of academic and artistic innovation. He even wrote a book in Latin. The discovery of America, the New World, provided a whole new stage for the innovative spirit of Henry, the first European ruler to study global geography. In his later years, Henry VIII was suspicious and suspicious, which was unavoidable for both ancient Chinese emperors and Western kings. But His Majesty the King has never doubted or scolded Edward. Edward's arrival disturbed the king. Henry VIII looked up and saw that it was Edward, and his angry expression turned into a happy expression like snow. No wonder Elizabeth was jealous of him. Henry VIII, who was lying on the bed, looked at his only son, feeling relieved, and asked in a doting tone, "My dear little Edward, what can I do for you, eh? Father, Isa is tired from playing with me today, so don't take the etiquette class tonight." Edward couldn't stand the king's tone, as if coaxing a child, although his current body is a child. "Okay, as long as you're happy." King Henry said very softly, "However, Edward, my health has been getting worse and worse recently, and you have to be ready to take on the responsibility of the Tudor royal family." The king's voice was slightly low. "The mission God entrusted to us as shepherds is about to pass into your hands, my child. I am going to meet God." The king's tone was a little sad. "You will be the King of England and Wales, and any stone that stands in your way will be kicked away." Edward was stunned by King Henry's words, not only surprised that the king's body was about to collapse, but also surprised by the meaning of the king's murderous words. Facts have proved that the king's words were not in vain. At the end of 1546, Henry VIII decided through Parliament to arrest Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who opposed the religious Reformation, which set off another wave of purges of counter-reformers. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, is the leader of the conservative faction. Thomas Howard, 1473 to 1554, formerly known as Thomas Howard, was a famous nobleman during the reign of King Henry VIII of England, son of the second Duke of Norfolk. In 1513 he was Lord of the Admiralty and helped defeat the Scots at the Battle of Florton. After inheriting his father's dukedom in 1524, he spearheaded the factional struggle against Thomas Wolsey, who was then president of the Royal Council, and replaced him in 1529. Supported his niece Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII in 1533, but presided over Anne's trial in 1536. He skillfully suppressed the rebellion of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and became the most powerful favorite of the king around 1540. His position was weakened by the execution of his niece Catherine Howard in 1542 and his son Henry Howard, 1517 to 1547, for treason. He was imprisoned on charges of complicity with his son, and in 1553 Queen Mary ordered his release. Generally speaking, he deserved what he deserved, and he has been doing it all the time. His son was hanged for treason in the Elizabethan period in history. I hope everyone will vote for recommendation. This is the greatest encouragement for me. Thank you. Chapter 6, The King and Number 039's Death. In late autumn, the weather is cloudy. The sycamore trees in front of the Duke of Norfolk's mansion have withered, red and yellow, overlapping layers, giving off a different flavor. And Thomas Howard, the owner of the Duke's mansion, who owned more than 100 acres, was writing something with candles in his study, and anyone who could read would be surprised to see it. Dear Sir John Flowerdew, our efforts still haven't changed His Majesty's will to tamper with God's decree. The Duke thought for a while, as if he had made up his mind, and wrote through gritted teeth, "So, we decided to use force to make God favor the whole of England again. I hope you can mobilize the local gentlemen to support us." The Duke of Norfolk wrote very excitedly, and his long-term depression seemed to be about to burst out, imagining that Henry VIII would be ousted from the throne and the Howard family would become the master of England. Suddenly, the silent air was cut off by something. There was a sudden knock on the door, and a slightly vicissitudes of voice sounded, "Your Excellency. Why are you bothering the Duke of Norfolk's mansion?" The voice suddenly became severe again. "Don't you know what a crime it is to disturb a Lord Duke's rest without reason?" The Lord Duke recognized the voice of his butler Andrew. "Oh no, my Lord Butler, I'm here following His Majesty's will." The young voice was mellow, but suddenly stiffened again when Andrew heard that it was the king's will. He suddenly choked to death. Since the War of the Roses in the previous generation, the king's strength has grown tremendously, and the nobles can no longer fight against the king. Wars of the Roses. Most of these wars were fought by armies of knights on horseback and their feudal entourage. Supporters of the House of Lancaster were mainly in the north and west of the country, while supporters of the House of York were mainly in the south and east. The massive casualties of the nobles caused by the War of the Roses, about 65 nobles above the baron, thousands of small and medium feudal lords, and more than 80,000 family soldiers, were one of the main reasons for the weakening of the feudal power of the nobles, which led to the Tudor dynasty. The development of a strong centralized monarchy. In fact, according to the statistics of later generations, in 1600, there were only 61 lords in England. In 1546 now, there are probably less than 50 nobles with titles. The Tudor dynasty is different from the European continent, relying on aristocratic rule. What he can rely on is a group of local gentlemen to rule in England from the 16th to the 17th century. There was no resident local government, only resident gentry, and they provided voluntary services. The gentry's self-government was loosely connected with a London central government and relied more on interpersonal relationships. That is to say, this is a social governance method centered on localism, linked by traditional cultural customs, and managed by gentry who voluntarily take up public office. To put it bluntly, it means that the local gentry are allowed to govern themselves. The judicial power is vested in the central government, and those who do not pay their wages are vain. And the royal power does not go to the countryside. Back to the topic, when the Duke of Norfolk heard this, he hurriedly lit the half-written credit candle. The young Judge Jackson pushed away butler Andrew and broke into the study directly. Kang dang. The door was roughly opened by the judge, and the young face faced the Duke directly. "Dear Duke, please come with us." Jackson didn't dare to treat the Duke like a housekeeper, because the nobles were connected online and offline, and who knew when he would be able to come out again. In fact, this is indeed the case. Less than an hour after the Duke of Norfolk was taken away, 3 waves of nobles came to ask for help, which made Henry VIII feel helpless. Can only be locked up. As time passed, step by step, the king's condition worsened step by step, but Edward, Elizabeth, and the eldest sister Mary stayed with the king and never left. Sometimes the king's sanity was clear, sometimes he was confused, and his whole body was aching and weak. Edward was very powerless about this. He was just a liberal arts student in his previous life, never studied medicine, and only knew some common medical knowledge. Although he had only lived with Henry VIII for more than 5 years, Edward received no less paternal love than others, so Edward felt as uncomfortable as Elizabeth and the others. Whitehall Palace, Windsor Castle, January 28, 1547. Whitehall Palace, also known as Whitehall, was the main residence of the King of England in London from 1530 to 1698. Located in London, England, at what is now Whitehall Street at this time, the Tudor royal family had moved to Whitehall Palace. To be precise, Henry VIII, Edward, the eldest Princess Mary, and the second Princess Elizabeth. The entire palace was silent, and the maids walked even softer, not daring to breathe heavily, and the atmosphere seemed very oppressive. In the king's bedroom, Queen Catherine Parr sat beside Henry VIII's bed, sobbing softly. In 1543, the elderly Henry married Catherine Parr, who served at court as his 6th wife. Catherine Parr was a twice-married widow with radical religious views, Henry a conservative. The two argued frequently, nearly costing her life a few times, but she always backed down in time under the influence of the Queen. Henry reconciled with his 2 daughters Mary and Elizabeth. Catherine Parr took good care of Henry's children Mary, Elizabeth and Edward, giving them a good education. She also took good care of Henry, who was ailing and easily irritable in his later years. Therefore, people in the entire palace respected this gentle and virtuous queen, and only she and Edward could dissuade Henry VIII, who was furious in his later years. His Majesty the King on the bed had his eyes tightly closed, but he opened them suddenly, and his snow-white face became rosy. The people in the room were not only not happy but even more sad. Most people know that people who are dying will have the phenomenon of returning to life, and this is what His Majesty the King is doing now. Plank, remember what I'm about to say. The king said to the clerk next to him in a full-fledged manner, "Yes, Your Majesty the King." The clerk responded with grief, "After my death, the throne shall go to Edward, Duke of Cornwall, or, if he is childless, to Mary." The king didn't worry about Edward's embarrassment, and immediately said, "If Mary is still childless, Elizabeth will inherit the throne." Also considering Edward's age, Edward Seymour, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury, Earl of Warwick John Dudley, formed the Regency Committee. The king thought about it, and said, "They represent king's business. Until Edward grows up to be 19." The king seemed to have exhausted all his strength and lay down directly. The ministers in the room were chattering, and the king gave them a difficult problem and created a new system of regency. Edward Seymour next to him suddenly smiled. He is Edward's uncle, a Protestant, and a triple jumper. Suddenly, a little maid tried the king's nose with her hand, then took it away suddenly, and shouted, "God has taken His Majesty the King." The tears that Edward had been holding back flowed uncontrollably all over his immature face. Thanks to 01234, I saw my conquest, Burial Night, Shangchu Wuxing, Shiandi Shindeo, Yuri Yefimovich Shelov, Book Friend 224XXXX42. Everyone's big recommendation votes support. I thank you everyone, your encouragement is my biggest motivation. Chapter 7 Coronation. The next day, a grand funeral was held at St. George's Cathedral in Windsor Castle. All 16 members of the region came to participate, and the nobles whose territories were near London also arrived. The first thing started was the ceremony. The maids cleaned the king's body, put on makeup, and dressed neatly. The clothes they wore were very gorgeous and solemn, giving people a sense of solemnity. Edward looked at the last side of his father in this life, and his heart was filled with emotion. It was this man who gave him a kingdom. Then moved to St. George's Cathedral, where the entire royal family stayed at the side, prayed and sang hymns, and at the same time put the body into the coffin and covered it with the first layer black wooden boards. Wait until the funeral is over, and pay homage to the remains before completely sealing the coffin. The funeral was presided over by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who sang hymns and prayed. Later, the collateral nobles of the Tudor royal family came to pay their respects. Because Catholicism advocates going to heaven after death, everyone who came to the ceremony smiled and bowed to the king's body. The coffin is usually held for 7 days, and the coffin is parked in St. George's Cathedral. Every day, nobles from all over the world and envoys from various countries come to pay their respects. The funeral ceremony is followed by the funeral ceremony. There is no specific date for the funeral ceremony. As long as it is convenient for everyone, it is usually held in the evening. Participating in the burial is mainly for the survivors of the deceased, and also to see the deceased for the last time. Participating in the funeral is mainly for a wide range of people. In addition to the relatives and friends of the deceased, the relatives and friends of the survivors also participate. Therefore, the funeral is more grand and has certain etiquette. Pray and sing hymns, and at the same time put the body into the coffin and cover it with the first layer of transparent boards. After the funeral is over, pay homage to the remains and then completely seal the coffin. St. George's Chapel is one of the main buildings in the west end of Windsor Castle, known as the British Royal Temple. This Gothic church was built in 1475. Many major events in British history took place here. Since the 18th century, 10 kings and 6 queens of British monarchs have been buried here after their death, including Queen Alexandra Victoria, who has been in power for 63 years, Edward VI, and of course the famous King Edward VIE, who only loves beauties but not country. After the abdication, it was called the Duke of Windsor. The church holds a celebration ceremony for the winners of the Order of Guard to pay homage to the king every year in the inner hall. People all over England are immersed in the sorrow of the king's death, and people within sight are worried about the situation of the country where the main minister is strong. The entire king's funeral was carried out for almost a month, and finally His Majesty the King was buried with his third wife Jane Seymour, because she gave birth to His Majesty's only male heir Edward. Let's take a look at the comments of later generations on him. During Henry VIII's reign, he carried out religious reforms, separated the Church of England from the Holy See, became the highest religious leader in England, made comprehensive reforms to national government agencies, and adopted a balanced foreign policy in Europe. safeguard the political and economic interests of the country. These have prompted great changes in Britain's socio-economic conditions, political system, culture, ideology, and religion, and eventually made Britain a unified and centralized modern nation-state, creating favorable conditions for the further development of capitalist factors. Henry VIII played a major role in this process as an absolute monarch with unprecedented power. Although he made a foolish move in the later period, he sold most of the benefits obtained by the Tudor royal family in the religious reform, which made the entire government's finances worse, which was the lead of the bourgeois revolution. The later Charles I of the Stuart dynasty led to an uprising led by Cromwell because of tax increases. This is also karma. Whoever told him that the Stuart family took advantage of it, they won a big country empty-handed. There is no such good advantage in the world. On February 25, 1547, at Westminster Abbey, Edward dressed in full costume and knelt on one knee, standing in front of Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Since Henry VIII carried out the Reformation, the king has replaced the Pope as the leader of the British religious circle. The Bishop of Canterbury is the highest office other than the king, and actually leads the Anglican Protestantism in England. The current Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, is a radical reformist and an important assistant to Henry VIII's reform. Edward got up early and followed his maid Luna to Westminster Abbey to practice the coronation ceremony early to avoid making a fool of himself walking in the corridors of the cathedral. I found that it is a typical Gothic building, which is extraordinarily magnificent and majestic. The colorful glass reflected in the sun in various colors highlights the unique splendor of the church. Westminster Abbey was built in 960 AD and is located on the north bank of the River Thames in London. It was built by Edward the Confessor and was canonized in 1065. Henry III vowed to build a more stately Gothic church in Edward's memory, so that little remains of the original structure. It is not only the chapel of the Anglican Church, where 38 British monarchs, including the current Queen, were crowned. At the same time, Westminster Abbey is also the auditorium where members of the British royal family hold their weddings, and it is also a state funeral mausoleum. Edward lowered his head, only hearing the loud voice of Archbishop Thomas. Edward VI, by the grace of God, King of England, France, and Ireland, keeper of the faith, head of the Church of England and Ireland. Edward VI, by the grace of God, King of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith and of the Church of England and also of Ireland and Earth's supreme head. With the addition of a series of titles, Thomas officially prepared to put the crown symbolizing royal power on Edward's head. At this moment, Edward stood up unreasonably abruptly, walked up to Bishop Thomas, who had already been stunned, and picked up the crown. I am not only the ruler of England, but also the representative of God on the world. Edward VI. After Edward pretended to say these words that stunned the nobles and envoys present, he put the crown on himself as a matter of course. Edward nodded apologetically to Archbishop Thomas, and the bishop, with his mouth wide open, slowly returned to normal color. His silver-white hair made Edward feel unbearable, but Edward quickly recovered his mood, and there was no room for any mistakes at this important moment. Immediately Edward raised the scepter symbolizing royal power and waved it to the surrounding nobles and gentlemen, and the scene was suddenly silent. Proxy! Someone shouted, as if a thunder had exploded. The stunned nobles and gentlemen. Proctor! Proxy! The nobles shouted loudly as if they had realized something, and the atmosphere suddenly became lively. People cheered with emotion, not noticing that His Majesty the King, who had just become Edward VI, breathed a sigh of relief. Phew! It's a good thing we arranged the procrastination in advance, otherwise it would be embarrassing. Edward took another breath. Oh! Travelers are not omnipotent, so we should do less of this kind of thing in the future. Thanks to 1234, Byzantium, Minhang Menghua, Yaolian Lancasterku, I don't know how to sweat during the day. Suyuhua, everyone's big votes. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 8 Discussion. Over time, the coronation took place at Westminster Abbey, publicized by the nobles and gentlemen who attended. It soon spread throughout England, and spread to the entire British Isles, and tended to go to Europe. An important town in the north, York. Since Henry VIII suppressed the rebellion of the northern border nobles, York has become the central city in the north of England. It is one of the few big cities in England except London, with a population of 30,000. Fraunce Tavern in York City is the most popular place, Not only the place that the guards like, but also the place where workers and free farmers like to come. There was not only a threepence mug of barley wine in the pub, but a liter of it. And I heard that the wine that the nobles drank cost as much as £1 for a small glass disc. God! Nobles are really rich, who would be so prodigal and drink this? Manonville, who owned 60 acres of land, couldn't help shaking his head. After Will usually farmed his own land, he would also lease the nobles' land. Thanks to the eruption of England's population, it only costs about £50 a year, and the remaining expenses are only a little over £8. It hurts Will to think about spending an eighth of a year's earnings on a glass of wine, regardless of the fact that Will doesn't make a lot of money, but in rural England, he belongs to the upper class. Except for the nobles, Will swaggered into the Frantz Tavern, and the people along the way saluted him, but he just nodded slightly and went straight into the tavern. The tavern changed from the hustle and bustle of the past, and suddenly became quiet, which made Will hardly get used to it. Will thoughtlessly walked into a circle surrounded by a crowd, only to hear a funny voice shouting the handsome and extraordinary Prince Edward was kneeling in front of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I saw him. The voice stopped abruptly at this point. What about the one in the back? Oh, God, I have the urge to kill you now. Peace. You little bastard, believe it or not, I'll beat you. The crowd couldn't help complaining loudly. When Will heard the scene of the coronation of the new king, he couldn't help pricking up his ears to listen carefully, but he stopped suddenly. Even if he was a local gentleman, he couldn't help but blurt out curses. The young man in the middle of the crowd stretched out a finger. I just want a glass of noble wine. Just a glass. At that time, £1 equals 20 shillings equals 240 pence. Usually, a piece of black bread with a length of 30 centimeters was enough for a family of 3 to eat 2 meals a day, and it only cost 2 pence. And £1 exists almost only in the fantasies of the poor and for the regulars who often come to the bar. It is also a bin number. Boom. The atmosphere at the scene became lively again. People were pointing at Pease and saying that he had a big appetite and wanted to drink like crazy. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, don't you want to know the situation at that time? This is what my cousin's uncle heard from Baron Wallach's housekeeper. Pease said again after a breath. The news is absolutely true. You don't know how wonderful the scene was. Pease said in a tone full of temptation. Will was a little moved when he heard this, and when he wanted to order a glass of wine, there was a sudden sound. France. Have a glass of wine for dear Pease. Okay. Dear Mr. Brad. Only Brad from the next village shouted first. Immediately, voices of admiration for Brad echoed in the tavern, and Brad's reputation suddenly rose to the top. At this time, Will's intestines were full of regrets, and he missed such a good opportunity to improve his reputation in England. The public office is held by gentlemen with high reputation, so fame is no less than a sharp weapon to a gentleman. Okay. Thank you, Master Brad, for the gift. Pease carefully held the wine glass, took a sip, and enjoyed it. The eyes of the people around were hot, and they couldn't help swallowing their saliva, staring straight at the wine glass. After Pease took a sip, he immediately spoke up. I saw Prince Edward standing up. At that time, the crown seemed to have grown a pair of wings, and it automatically flew to the top of the prince's head, emitting white light. Pease said exaggeratedly. The crown fell on the prince's head, and the prince immediately raised his scepter and said, I am the ruler of England, and I am the agent of God on the world. His Majesty is smiling. When Pease said this, he immediately made a pious Christian action, and the people around him couldn't help but follow suit, praising God and His Majesty the King. After Pease finished speaking, he hurried out, came to a dilapidated alley, and saw a crack. How hurriedly reached in and took out a £1 gold coin. His nervous heart was relieved immediately, and he opened his mouth happily. Be happy. As long as you say it 10 more times on such occasions, you will get another £1, said a man covered in a cloak in the depths of the alley. Pease knew that this was his rich man, and believed that what he said was true, but he didn't want to get closer to him. Pease felt that this person was very dangerous, and his whole body was covered with a cold aura, which made people very uncomfortable. Yes, my lord, I will work hard. Pease flattered, and the man responded coldly, and disappeared in an instant. Pease turned his head and left indifferently, looking for a new place to make money. Oh no. It's the speech. Madrid, Spain. Charles V was lying in bed, listening to his courtier talk about the coronation in England. Oh, another Henry VIII? A new troublesome little guy, sighed Charles V. The palace minister, who was reading the letter, catered carefully, showing his true dog legs. Charles V is the son of Philip I of the Habsburg family and Juana, Queen of Castile, Mad Juana, Ferdinand I of Aragon and Castile, grandson of Isabel I of Leon, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Duchess Mary of Burgundy, born in Ghent and raised in the Low Countries. His childhood teacher was Adrian of Utrecht. Later Pope Adrian VI Charles inherited the Low Countries and Franche-Comté in 1506, the year his father died. When his mighty maternal grandfather Ferdinand II died in 1516, he became the owner of a vast domain that included his mother's Castile and Ferdinand I's Kingdom of Aragon, the Kingdom of Styria, the Kingdom of Navarre, the Kingdom of Granada, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Sicily, Sardinia, and the entire Spanish America. During his reign, Spain's colonies in America were expanded due to the conquest of Mexico and Peru. Several times upon his arrival in Spain he had to fight against cities fighting for self-government, and some Spanish nobles resented the fact that he had placed some Flemish officials in Castile. In the end, all resistance was overwhelmed by him, and an obedient and strong Spain formed the basis for his future galloping in Europe. He continued to expand Spain's absolute monarchy and use it to establish the Spanish Empire that dominated Christian Europe. He possesses a dizzying array of titles that speak volumes for his power. Well, this is a public chapter, so I'll give it a go. Everyone get ready, sit tight, I'm going to drive Charles, Carlos, Carol, Carl, Carlo, Charles, by God, Holy Roman Emperor, Augustus Eternal, King of the Roman people, King of Italy, all Spaniards, Castile, Aragon, Leon, Navarre, Granada, Toledo, Valencia, Galicia, Majorca, Seville, Córdoba, Murcia, Jaén, King of Garvey, Algeciras, Gibraltar, Canary Islands, King of Sicily, King of Naples, King of Sardinia and Corsica, King of Jerusalem, King of the East and West Indies, Grand Duke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, Duke of Brabant, Duke of Lorraine, Duke of Styria, Duke of Carinthia, Duke of Carniola, Duke of Limburg, Duke of Luxembourg, Duke of Gelderland, Duke of Württemberg, Count of Alsace, Marquess of Namur, Count of Flanders, Count of Habsburg, Count of Tyrol, Count of Gorizia, Count of Barcelona, Count of Charolais, Count of Avitor, Count of Burgundy-Palatinate, Count of Hainaut, Count of Holland, Count of Zutphen, Count of Roussillon. Thanks to WeWayU 0026 amp. Number 183K, holding hands in 2015, Fania has been in Aurora for 3,000 years, slackers love to be late, fac bellum, stand alone, everyone's big vote. Support Chapter 9. The Night Interview with Thomas Cranmer. A month has passed since Edward's coronation, and Edward has begun to deal with government affairs. 1547, March 25th, the weather? Everyone knows that the weather in the UK is sunny in the morning and rainy at noon. When you meet a Chinese, you first ask if you have eaten, while the British ask each other what the weather is like. Because of the characteristics of an island country, even if the place is small, the weather in different parts of the UK is different due to the terrain. Regardless of the weather, Edward will be dealing with government affairs on this day anyway. In Whitehall Palace in Windsor Castle, Edward is sitting on the throne, listening to the 16 regent ministers discussing the political process. I saw Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, wearing a black tuxedo, with two beards, looking very sexy, with sharp slashed cheeks, holding a cane in one hand, and looking at many ministers with sharp eyes. I propose to decide on the leading sheep among us first. Everyone knows that a flock without a leading sheep cannot be raised. Earl Edward cast his eyes on many ministers, and everyone knew that among the regent ministers, only Earl of Warwick John Dudley could compete with Sir Edward, and both had 6 votes of support, so everyone's eyes turned to Earl of Warwick. John Dudley served as the local governor of Calais, France, occupied by the British in 1538, as the Minister of Naval Affairs in 1542, participated in the invasion of Scotland in 1544, occupied the city of Boulogne in France in the same year, and was named Earl of Warwick in 1546, became a member of the Regency Council in 1547. The Earl of Warwick was tall and burly, with beards growing on his cheeks, 2 thick eyebrows hung straight on his eyes, and the dark green eyes were particularly sharp and exposed due to years of marching. The sitting posture is very upright, and the hands are covered with thick calluses. The Earl was stared at by everyone without any sign of anxiety. He slowly picked up the teacup, took a sip, and said unhurriedly, "Sir Seymour's right, we are going to make a judgment." Exclamation mark. Your Lord Earl emphasizes his pronunciation. Yes. Yes. It is indeed necessary to make a decision. Hearing that the 2 big bosses agreed, there is no reason for the younger brothers to disagree, and there was a voice of second opinion from below. Then, let's vote to decide. What do you think? His Excellency the Archbishop of Canterbury. Sir Edward suddenly asked His Excellency Thomas Cranmer, who had been pretending to be transparent to him. I follow everyone's wishes. Bishop Thomas coughed, said something that followed the crowd, and then fell silent. So, what do you think? Your Majesty the King. Earl Seymour turned around and asked Edward again. After making clay statues of bodhisattvas for so long, Edward finally had to say. Edward suddenly had a feeling of being valued by others, and suddenly had the urge to fuck a dog. Motherfucker. You only come to ask me after you have made a decision. You really think that I have stamped it? However, now Edward is indeed stamped, without any rights, because as a 10-year-old child, Edward has no dignity in front of these uncles. A king without majesty, so that the ministers do not have the slightest fear, naturally have no right to speak. Moreover, it is clear that Henry VIII specifically stated that the ministers, regardless of size, are just to check and balance your threat to the royal power, so turn around and forget it. Now Edward hated it to death, but he had to make an expression of happy agreement, not to mention how awkward it was. Yes, Uncle. Edward's voice was still so immature and loud. Then, let's vote. Earl Seymour announced the start of voting. I think Earl Seymour is very suitable to lead us to discuss state affairs, and he is also the uncle of His Majesty the King, so he can better understand his wishes. Not long after the start, a chubby minister loudly supported Seymour. I don't think so. I think the Earl of Warwick is suitable, and everyone knows his exploits. Another thin man pointed sharply at Mayman. With the quarrel between the two, the entire conference hall became lively like a vegetable market. As time passed, gradually there were 6 votes on both sides, with 3 abstentions, leaving only Archbishop Thomas silent. Immediately, everyone's eyes focused on the old bishop again, but the bishop did not move as time passed and everyone looked a little impatient. The Archbishop said, I think Earl Seymour is more suitable. No one thought that Archbishop Thomas would choose Earl Seymour. Everyone knew that His Majesty the Bishop had always had a good relationship with Earl Warwick, who was keen on radical reforms, and despised Earl Seymour, who relied on his sister's skirt to get to the top. The choice of Bishop Thomas not only shocked the passers-by and ministers, but also caused the Earl of Warwick, who was drinking tea, to accidentally break his teacup. Lord Earl never expected his old friend to play this trick, which made his normally moody face full of shock. My Lord Earl, this is a precious tea set brought from China in the Far East. You have to pay for it. Edward's voice sounded at the right time, alleviating the Earl's shock, and immediately turned into that poker face again. Your Majesty, I will send you 2 sets of Oriental porcelain later. The Earl immediately reciprocated and sent 2 sets of porcelain, which really comforted Edward's young heart. Haha. If it weren't for the fact that you lost so badly that the Seymour family would dominate, I wouldn't bother to talk to you. Edward sneered in his heart. Sir Seymour, however, had a serious expression on his face, sitting upright and listening to the Archbishop's words, without changing his face in the slightest. Full marks for this performance, Sir Seymour. The future Best Actor Oscar is waiting for you. The meeting that followed became a little boring, and it was almost Edward Seymour's talk. As a result, Earl Seymour proclaimed himself the Duke of Somerset through the political conference, which almost passed the appointment at the fastest speed. From this, it can be seen that Earl Edward Seymour is very concerned about the title. After all, as the son of a jazz, working with those aristocrats with a long history, not to mention on the surface, in fact, he still has a low self-esteem in his heart. Edward Seymour, whose sister Jane Seymour married King Henry VIII in 1536, was favored and rose to the top. In 1542, he served as Secretary of the Navy. In 1544, he led his troops to invade Scotland and plundered Edinburgh, 1544. He fought against France at Boulogne in 1545 and achieved another brilliant victory. After Henry VIII's death, 1547, he was appointed regent to Edward VI, soon Duke, and effectively acted as acting king for 2.5 years. The Regency Committee came to an end with the triumphant sound of Duke Seymour, the frustration of the Earl of Warwick, and the depression of Edward. No one noticed that His Majesty the new King of England visited the residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury in the middle of the night thanks to Su Yuhua, evildoer, 01234, Big Ship Dictionary. I really can't type this big name, LXAX. Fenya has been in the Aurora for 3,000 years. Lancaster Ku, Kugao Heo, Yefet's Happy Life, Kong Kong Taoist, his person 1111. Thank you for your great support. Chapter 10. The gentleman deceives his way. As night fell slowly, Bishop Thomas Mansion was shrouded in the white fog of London, looming. Only a slight outline could be seen since Henry VIII carried out the Reformation, Most of the property belonging to the Catholic Church was almost annexed by the Tudor royal family. The teaching property belonging to the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, including the residence where Bishop Thomas now lives, was confiscated by the Tudor royal family. However, in the later period, Henry VIII not only fought with the French, but also dared to interfere with the succession of the Scottish throne. In the end, he not only sold most of the land and properties confiscated by the Reform, but also owed a lot of debt. Therefore, Bishop Thomas bought the original property and used it as his own residence. So since all the property of the church was confiscated, how did Thomas have the money to redeem it? Let's get to know him. Cranmer was born on July 2, 1489 in Ilkeston, Nottinghamshire, England. His father, Thomas Cranmer, had little property and belonged to the lower class of country gentlemen. He first studied in the countryside, entered Cambridge University in 1503, was selected into Jesus College in 1510 or 1511 to engage in theological research, was ordained in 1523, and soon received a doctorate in theology. Distinguished theologian, he was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in March 1533. This position became the highest priesthood in the Church of England after Britain severed its relationship with the Holy See. Historically, Cranmer served in this position for 20 years through the two dynasties of Henry VIII and Edward VI. He approved Henry VII's divorce from Catherine and marriage to Anne Boleyn, and participated in the advancement of the English Reformation movement. Based on his profound theological theory, he published a series of propositions and writings of the Reformed Church with reference to the main points of various Protestant schools, providing the theoretical basis for the English Reformation. So is it possible for you to let a reformed person reform his own property? Like some significant property he can only give up, such as a house, but there are not too many gold coins and the like. Almost at the moment when the former teaching property was sold, Bishop Thomas bought it. Edward brought a few guards to the gate of Bishop Cranmer's mansion. Looking at this complex of palaces, no less than Whitehall Palace, he couldn't help feeling, the church is really rich, the Catholic Church is really rich. For example, Ampton Palace, where Edward often went, belonged to a wealthy Bishop of Worthy. Because he offended Henry VIII, his assets were confiscated after the Reformation, and even the famous universities of later generations, Oxford University and Cambridge University, were his assets. This does not include its dozens of properties and shops in London. The religious reform in England not only fed the Tudor royal family, but also relieved the nobles who had been severely injured in the War of the Roses. Even ordinary farmers got a few acres of land, which greatly eased the social contradictions of population growth at that time. Therefore, the religious reform in England is a feast of sharing meals. It is in line with the popular will, and it is the inevitable result of the general trend. Back to the topic, while Edward sighed, he was taken to the bishop's study by Bishop Cranmer's butler. The butler was raised by the Cranmer family, so he won the bishop's trust and was sent to welcome Edward. Edward asked several guards to wait outside the door, and walked into the study alone. The butler closed the door casually and stood guard at the door, so the few guards at the door stared and stood directly at the door. At this time, the bishop was looking at a book casually, nodding with relish. Edward read it carefully, and it turned out to be the original work of Ethics by Aristotle. It seems that the bishop is an open-minded person, not a rigid-minded person. Yes, rigid thinking is impossible to help Henry VIII carry out the religious reform. Edward thought silently in his heart. After waiting for almost half an hour, Edward was the first to speak. "Dear Bishop Cranmer, here I come." Immediately Edward realized that he had fallen into Cranmer's pace. Old fox. Edward cursed uncontrollably in his heart. Oh, so it's His Majesty the King. Look at me. I'm old and fascinated by reading. I'm so sorry. Bishop Cranmer looked apologetic. Edward felt that he was still too immature, so he fell for him by accident. He was very cautious about this old fox Edward, and spent a lot of energy to face it. Honorable Archbishop. Today I am here for my uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. Edward carefully chose his words. "And what happened to the Duke?" the bishop asked casually. "Don't you think it's inappropriate to grant all the power to a minister?" Edward asked back. "Only the king can exercise the rights bestowed by God in this way." Edward added a little more information, "And this is not the will of the previous king." Bishop Cranmer frowned when he heard Edward bring up God and the former king. If Edward promised titles and money, Cranmer didn't care so much. As an archbishop who abides by the canons, he has already sat on the top teaching position in England, and has countless teaching properties. Life should not be too perfect, but Bishop Cranmer, from a small priest, without any background, jumped to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury in this world ruled by nobles, almost directly relying on Henry VIII. It is supported by the arbitrariness of the universe. I heard that some nobles offered a sky-high price of £100,000 at that time. You must know that the Tudor, dual, government at that time had not yet carried out religious reforms, and the annual income was only £120,000. But Henry VIII still believed that he was the main candidate for reform and let him take the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. Thinking of Henry VIII's support, even though more than 10 years have passed, Cranmer still remembers it fresh as for Edward blaming himself with the theory of the divine right of kings he edited. He was speechless. Edward stared closely at the bishop. A trace of cold sweat broke out on his palms. Oh, I was careless. I shouldn't have a showdown right away. After a while, Seymour will come back after he does something out of line. Edward felt a trace of regret instantly after speaking in his heart. Bishop Cranmer pondered for a while, then said helplessly, "Your Majesty the King, I will not do anything against the Duke of Somerset now." He changed his voice again. "However, I will be neutral in future regency meetings." Edward forcibly held back his excitement, thanked him and then consciously exited the study after closing the door casually. Several guards immediately followed behind and walked out of the mansion together. After returning to his study, he couldn't help the excitement in his heart and laughed out loud. "Haha. It's so risky. It's really hard to change the person. This is what a gentleman can bully." Thanks to 01234, Lancaster QJSJ Kong Taoist, especially the God of Harmony, Book Friend 150,508,170,639,058, Ye Fat's Happy Life, Hugo is Good, His Person 1111, Everyone's Big Vote Support, Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 11 Reorganization of N number 039, Shadow N number 039. Edward was very happy today, because today he finally settled Bishop Thomas Cranmer, making a good start for the coup d'etat. 2 years later, within 10 minutes of being happy, Edward began to summarize his gains and losses today. First, too much contempt for the ancients. If it weren't for the great favor left by Henry VIII, Bishop Cranmer would not necessarily change his mind. Second, too impatient. He ran to the bishop's mansion overnight, so that the original conditions that could have been fought for were only half completed, and only the right to neutrality was won. The original plan to strive for full investment in himself failed well. Still, his own conditions are not enough, so he can only be moved by the favor of Henry VIII. But Henry VIII's usant is really good. If the news of the day of the coronation hadn't been spread so widely, wouldn't that old fox of Cranmer not necessarily remember Henry VIII's kindness? Edward thought so, and suddenly a guard came to report that Baron Smith had come to see him. That's right. Everyone guessed that it was Baron Smith who took the lead in calling the substitute at the coronation that day, and his rough voice was just suitable for taking the lead. "Uncle Smith, you came just in time. Haven't I thanked you for your help that day?" Edward thanks small matter. "Edward, your performance that day scared me to death." He became excited again. "But what you said that day was really exciting, and those Catholics almost fainted." "Haha." Baron Smith's laughter almost shook the floor, showing how happy he was indeed. Edward's actions almost declared that he, as the new king, clearly supported Protestantism in England and opposed Catholicism, and Baron Smith is a Protestant. If he was not a Protestant, he would not have gained the trust of Henry VIII and served as the chief of the royal guard. "Uncle Smith, is your eldest son, Vega, an adult?" "Yes, your Majesty." Baron Smith seemed to have expected something, and responded with mixed surprises. "Then let him come to the crown to be my attendant." Edward's voice at this time was so pleasant to Baron Smith's ears. "If you serve as the king's attendant, you will often see His Majesty the King. If you do meritorious service in the future, you may become a nobleman with a fief. Only in this way will you be a real nobleman, not a court nobleman." Baron Smith came excitedly, and returned excitedly. Next, Edward began to meet the Shadow, a secret organization that helped Henry VIII find out about the Catholic property. There were only about 20 or 30 people. In fact, the monarchs of any era will have spy organizations to work for them, and the monarchs who do not have will become deaf and blind. The Ming dynasty in history was only strengthened and made public. Even the prosperity of Kangxi and Qianlong advocated by later generations will have blood drops and sticky sticks to serve them. The most obvious example is the poor Chongzhen emperor. He, a prince who had not been educated by the monarch, suddenly sat on the throne. Bewitched by the Donglan party, he carelessly disbanded Dongcheng and Jinaiwei. Weapons and food, absorbing Daming's blood to strengthen himself. But the poor Emperor Chongzhen still didn't know anything, and he was trapped in the circle and perished. To put it simply, the army is the bright sword of the monarch, and those like genuity are the dark swords in the sleeves, and they are indispensable. The shadow organization was born by Henry VIII in order to ascertain the property of the Catholic Church. In fact, Henry VIII was too poor, and he didn't plan to let go of any loopholes and catch them all. However, since the death of Henry VIII, Edward has actually mastered this organization. Everyone will ask at this time, is there no thorn? Then Shunley would completely control the organization. In fact, it is not that difficult for Edward to control this organization. There are two main points. One is that this organization has a small number of people, only about 30 people in total, and the scale is not large. Second, like all spy organizations, they have no independent financial resources and rely entirely on funding from the royal family for their activities. For example, in the promotion of Edward's coronation ceremony last time, Edward allocated £500, which was almost the income of the shadow. In the past year, Edward carefully looked at the man kneeling on one knee in front of him. He has a head of greasy black hair, loose, and a long unkempt beard hanging from his chin. He is a non-mainstream figure in the 21st century, about 1.7 meters tall. He looks extraordinarily burly, but his narrow shoulders and slender arms reveal his inner strength well. At first glance, it is caused by not developing well since childhood. According to the information, his name is Guy Ham, the leader of the Shadows. Okay. The former His Majesty the King rarely had the habit of recording information. His name was introduced by himself. He was the son of a Fallon squire and could read Braille. Guy, how has the task been completed in the past month? Guy replied with his head lowered, Your Majesty, thanks to the blessing of the Lord, the entire 39 counties of England are proclaiming that you were blessed by the Lord when you were crowned, and your deeds have been brought to Wales and Scotland by a small businessman. Guy didn't mean to underestimate Edward at all. He answered very seriously, and flattered him unconsciously. Your current deeds are being talked about by people throughout England. Guy's tone was filled with envy. People are now proud to have a king blessed by God. Your reputation now surpasses that of the previous king. Guy made a loud summary at the end, expressing his admiration for Edward unabashedly. After all, shameless self-promotion like Edward was rare in the late Middle Ages. The nobles don't care what the untouchables think of them, and they don't have the cheekiness of Edward to promote themselves. After all, it is embarrassing to be known. Little did they know that things were different in England than in continental Europe. The current English aristocracy is not strong, and the king's power cannot go deep into the local area, so the entire English countryside is controlled by prestigious squires. They not only act as kings to govern the local area, but also have the qualifications to be elected to the House of Commons. To use a metaphor, they are equivalent to the powerful landlords in the late Eastern Han Dynasty, and the nobles are the aristocratic families. They do not have the strength and stature of the nobles, so they can only rely on the support of the local people to manage the place and share the benefits left by the nobles. So fame is very important to them, and it is also a weapon they use against the king, because they are the representatives of the people's opinion. So you can confidently oppose the king, and the lower parliament is their concentration camp. And if Edward wants to exercise the royal power, he must have a good reputation among the people in order to let the local squires support him in his own administration. In the centralization of power, let those peasants not blindly follow the squire against themselves. Through this incident, Edward discovered the great use of shadows, and it should be more useful. So, Edward decided to reorganize the shadow. Thanks to ZHP 999, Minhang Dream Talk, Monster, I Saw I Conquered, Fanya crossed Aurora for 3,000 years, Lancaster Coup, JJC 1221, The Temptation of Death, Forgive me for not being able to type Japanese, Suyuho for their support. Chapter 12, The Birth of the Dark Blade. In the dim study room, even with candles lit, Guy couldn't fully see Edward's figure, but he felt that Edward seemed to be brewing something, and waited patiently. Edward thought for a while, and said a little nervously, Guy, I think it's time for the shadow to reform. Guy stood and listened carefully to what His Majesty was about to say. When he heard the word reform, his heart was agitated, like knocking over a wine jar, not knowing whether it was delicious or intoxicating. Edward didn't care about Guy's mood swings at all, and continued, I decided to change the shadow's name to Dark Blade. Edward was going to change it to Jin Yui, but thinking about the fact that the Ming Dynasty is still there is no telling when we will meet again in the future. That would be embarrassing. Even though the translation is different, the meaning is similar. Since then, the Dark Blade has been called the Angel of the Night by those nobles, and the Vampire of the Night by the spies of the enemy country. Edward said that he is a man of integrity. He will not do things like imitation, even if imitation must be combined with the actual imitation. Not reckless. Guy, as long as you do well, There is no hope for the Baron and Viscount in the future, but knights and jazz are still possible. Edward suddenly said something that made Guy's blood pressure rise. Although knights and jazz are not nobles, they are preparatory nobles, and they are the closest nobles to the common people at the bottom like knights and jazz. They have the right to directly meet the king, can directly participate in and manage places in the county, and can have their own fiefs. Although you only own one or a few villages, they can be passed on from generation to generation, which means that your blood has begun to become noble. And you will no longer be at the mercy of the nobles, and your life will be determined. Guy thought a lot about the benefits of becoming a knight for a while. Even if his brain was exhausted, he didn't think about it. However, he only knows that His Majesty the King can make him a knight, and a knight can change his destiny, change the destiny of his family, and give his children the chance to become a master. So, even though he knew it was a slim chance, Guy was unwilling to give up. He immediately knelt down on one knee and gave a very decisive knight salute. I, Guy Ham, under the witness of God, I and my descendants swear unswerving allegiance to King Edward VI and his descendants. Descendants, let Satan steal my soul if you violate it. Edward watched him swear the oath of allegiance, and didn't stop him. He just picked up the back of his sword and patted his shoulders after he finished speaking, expressing his acceptance of his allegiance. Guy stood up with a blushing face, looked at Edward enthusiastically, and hoped that Edward would send him a mission to make him a knight as soon as possible. Okay Guy, tell me about the current situation of the shadow. Edward reminded Guy. Okay, Your Majesty the King. After a while, Guy changed into his original poker face, hiding his excitement. Originally, he was always a calm person, but he was overwhelmed by the desire to become a nobleman, and he immediately returned to his original state after being reminded. It can be seen that everyone in this world has desires, and there is no perfect person. As long as the right medicine is prescribed, there will be unexpected results. In fact, it can be seen from Guy's life experience that he is obsessed with a revival of his family. As long as he prescribes the right medicine, he may succeed. Therefore, Edward succeeded, seduced Guy with a title, and gained a useful subordinate with the support of the late king. I organized 28 bankrupt gentlemen like me. Guy paused. We have been traveling to and from 39 counties in England, looking for wealthy churches to be confiscated by the court for increasing revenue. Yes, Henry VIII is so domineering. In 1536, he passed the parliamentary decree to establish the Court of Increasing Income, which was the first special court for the purpose of managing confiscated monastery property and investigating information about monasteries around the world. It also collected the tithes and knightly donations of the previous church, so the annual income of the Tudor dynasty increased from £120,000 to £250,000, which greatly stabilized the rule of the Tudor royal family. There is nothing left to do with the shadow. To put it bluntly, it is just an institution that seeks money for the royal family. Edward then had a long talk with Guy, who didn't sleep in the middle of the night, and had an in-depth exchange on the shadow reorganization at around 5 o'clock in the morning. The next day, Edward and Guy walked out of Edward's study with 2 pairs of panda eyes and bloodshot eyes. Guy, take this manuscript and correct it according to the requirements on it. Yes, Your Majesty the King. Guy replied very seriously. According to the plan, Dark Blade will use a small restaurant in London under the name of the royal family as its headquarters in the future. According to Edward's request, the Dark Blade's initial task was to monitor London. Even if a mouse died in London, Guy returned to his home in the west of the city. It was a low wooden house with cracks on the wooden door. There was nothing in the house except a wooden bed. The only valuable thing was the quilt made of linen. Guy is 25 years old this year. Since his family went bankrupt at the age of 16, his wife divorced him and took away the only property in the family, the 10-acre land deed. Guy doesn't blame her, because it is her dowry, so Guy can only live alone for 10 years. This dilapidated house in London was rewarded by the king. Don't think that it is worthless if it is dilapidated. Now it costs at least £6 to buy. When I got home, it was still dark, and Guy was reluctant to buy candles, so he could only eat something before reading this planning book. Guy took out a black bread from under the bed, soaked it in water until soft, and eagerly ate it. After eating for about half an hour, it was done, and Guy immediately began to look through the proposal that Edward made with him last night. To be precise, Edward made it by himself, and he was only in a consulting role. I saw Edward wrote this. First, the shadow was renamed Dark Blade. Second, Dark Blade was directly under the leadership of the king, and no one was allowed to intervene. Article 3, there shall be 1 leader, 3 deputy leaders, 12,000 commanders, 10 centurions each under their jurisdiction, and each centurion leads 10 teams. Each team has a captain and a deputy leader, and has 8 10 in total. Article 4. 1 centurion is stationed in each county, and 4 are stationed in London to monitor the situation in various places. They gather in London every year and report on their work. Article 5. No one may violate the king's orders, and those who violate the order will be punished by the Ministry of Justice and Punishment according to the law. Article 6. Set up the Judiciary Department, which is composed of the leader of the punishment and the 3 commanders of the punishment, and is responsible for dealing with local rebels and foreign spies, as well as violators of the law. 7th. 8th. Waiting for the 29-point opinion outline, which involves the rights and obligations of the dark blade, is stricter than that of government departments. Even though Guy had already prepared last night, he was still taken aback thanks to Minhang Menghua, Hizi, Tuitty, Fan I, Rang Deoti, Lancaster Ku, everyone for your support. Chapter 13. The Marriage of Catherine Parr. Edward stayed up all night, and then told Lucy not to disturb him, and he had to catch up on sleep, because he felt that his body was still weak, and he couldn't hurt himself too much for his little brother. Lucy also fulfilled her responsibility very well. She stopped being naughty as usual, and began to help Edward undress when Edward lay on the bed. He couldn't stand the fatigue anymore, and slowly closed his eyes. Lucy helped Edward cover the goose-down quilt, and closed the door lightly. Lucy knew that Edward should not make any noise before going to bed, otherwise he would not be able to fall asleep. I don't know how long it took Edward to feel his neck was sore, his brain was dizzy, and his mouth was thirsty like hell. I can only get up in a daze. Lucy. Lucy. Pour me a glass of water. The first thing Edward did after waking up was to call Lucy for water, and Lucy didn't let Edward down. After a while, footsteps came, and Lucy brought a glass of warm water to Edward's mouth, and Edward drank it in big gulps. After drinking a large glass of water, Edward breathed a sigh of relief and hiccuped. His whole body felt happy, and the fatigue from staying up late disappeared without a trace. Your Majesty, you know that you are not in good health, so don't stay up all night. You don't know how much we worry about you, Lucy said with concern while helping Edward dress. Edward knew that his physical condition was not good, and he was also in the wrong, so he couldn't make any arguments, so he had no choice but to raise his hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay. I surrender. Sister Lucy is right. I will try not to stay up late in the future. Lucy laughed at Edward's tired look. Your Majesty, when you fell asleep, Princess Mary, Princess Elizabeth, and Queen Catherine all came to see you. What? The sisters and the Queen Mother are here. Well, the Duke of Somerset also sent people to greet you. Archbishop Cranmer, the Earl of Walkerley, all sent people to greet you. Case Edward did not expect that he would attract almost everyone's attention after sleeping. Edward has not yet adjusted to his identity, even though he currently has no rights, but he now represents England and Wales, as well as Ireland, which is not very obedient, and his every move is eye-catching. Just now, after hearing that Edward had woken up, the 16 regents outside Windsor Castle heaved a sigh of relief, because if there is any accident for Edward, it is expected that Princess Mary will ascend the throne, and there is no need for the Regency Council to exist, and they will no longer act as kings. Before Edward could catch his breath, he saw a gust of wind blowing in, and a figure hugged him tightly, strangling Edward so much that he couldn't speak. Needless to say, Edward knew it was Elizabeth, and the helpless Edward could only remind Lucy with his eyes. Seeing this, Lucy immediately understood and said to Elizabeth, Your Highness, please release His Majesty the King, he is almost out of breath. Lucy's hint was very effective. Elizabeth yelled, Let go of Edward, and looked down at her feet with a flushed face. Edward took this opportunity to take a big breath of fresh air, and Elizabeth lowered her head even more. Seeing this, Isa, don't be so reckless in the future, you have to look like a princess. Edward took this opportunity to teach Princess Elizabeth a lesson, and Elizabeth bowed her head in embarrassment. Without saying a word, Edward was very satisfied with Elizabeth's obedience, and he couldn't help feeling proud. But such a happy time didn't last long, and Elizabeth returned to her original state. Hey, Edward, you have taught your sister a lesson. Do you know that enough is enough? Yes. Yes. I understand. I understand. Facing Elizabeth, who had recovered her combat power, Edward could only back down. Edward's concession obviously worked, and Elizabeth gave Edward a proud look, looking extraordinarily cute. Seeing that Edward was fine, he turned around, shook his beautiful long blonde hair, and hopped out of the bedroom door on moccasin boots. So, I almost forgot. After you woke up, Catherine said that she had something to discuss with you. When Elizabeth was about to leave, she suddenly dropped such a sentence that made Edward puzzled. Edward can't care so much now, the most urgent thing is to fill his stomach. Half an hour later, Edward took his little maid Lucy to Queen Catherine's bedroom. Along the way, Edward thought about Queen Catherine's life experience, and wondered what she would do to him if she had nothing to do. In 1529, aged 17, Catherine married Edward Bow, 2nd Baron Borough of Gainsborough. Edward died in the spring of 1532. Catherine Parr married John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer of Snape, North Yorkshire in 1534. In 1536, during the Pilgrimage of Mercy, Catherine was taken hostage by northern rebels along with her 2 stepchildren. John Neville died in 1543, at the home of Princess Mary, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, later Mary I. Catherine Parr caught the king's attention. After the death of her second husband, the wealthy widow developed an affair with Thomas Seymour, 1st Baron Seymour of Sudeley, brother of Queen Jane Seymour, but the king liked her very much, and she had to accept the king's love according to history. Is it possible that she and Edward's cheap second uncle, Thomas Seymour, have rekindled their old relationship? Definitely is. Edward and Lucy arrived at Whitehall Palace together. Boom, boom, boom. Lucy went forward and knocked on the door. Soon a curvaceous maid came out and led Edward into the bedroom, and suddenly a sense of wealth and grandeur came over his face, which made Edward very unaccustomed because Edward felt that he was already the King of England, Wales, and Ireland, and he was too noble, and no matter how well he decorated, he couldn't go any further. On the contrary, the simple decoration is more realistic. In fact, Edward's idea was wrong at this time. During Henry VIII's time, a French envoy visited England. Henry VIII received the envoy in gold and silver because of the money of the Reformation. As a result, after the envoy returned to France, he lavishly praised England, calling it a civilized country and a civilized country. Yes, the former continental European countries have always regarded England as a barbarian country and uncivilized. From this we can see how far people worshipped money at that time. Edward can't control her either, because the Queen can use her dowry at will with a respectful heart. Edward met Queen Catherine, while the little maid Lucy had already stayed outside the door. The Queen's face is very delicate, which is different from the roughness of Westerners, and her figure is not out of shape, and there is a touch of extravagance. No wonder Edward's cheap second uncle still likes her. She was hesitant to speak, but after a while she seemed to have made up her mind, and said shyly, "Edward, I've decided to marry your uncle Thomas Seymour, thanks to Yuri Yefimovich Serov, his 1111-01234, funeral night, Minhang Dream Talk, everyone's support." Chapter 14. The First Mission. Edward now felt that he was almost the richest person in England, even in continental Europe, except for the church, and this little money can be completely consumed by the country in just one war. According to statistics, between 1511 and 1547, Henry VIII spent a huge amount of £2,134,784 in France and Scotland, which even triggered local rebellions in England, so Edward was too happy too early. Governing the country is not that simple at this time. Money plays an extremely important role. He can redeem your life for you in the war, turn a despicable businessman into a nobleman, and revive a country that is on the verge of bankruptcy and without money. Even if you are an aristocrat, you can be more despicable than a businessman. Even if you have a country with a virtuous king and virtuous ministers, it will perish in an instant. Therefore, Charles I of the Stuart dynasty was guillotined for money. Louis V of the French Bourbon dynasty not only sent himself to the guillotine, but also sent his family to the guillotine. So money is a kind of original sin. And it was also the greatest pursuit of Europeans in their lives at that time. Edward stopped lusting and began to think about how to spend the money. Continue to open the tavern? No. The whole of England has already met the market demand, and any more will not be worth the candle. Or open a pub in Europe. Good idea, just do it, ha ha ha. Edward was very proud of his ideas. Forgive the naivety of a college student starting a business, etc. I can learn from the practice of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, adopt orphans, and cultivate strength. Edward decided to adopt orphans to cultivate his true strength. Edward's decision to do so was also based on the social situation at the time. The period of the 16th century was a period of population explosion across the British Isles. The population of Wales rose from 210,000 in 1500 to 380,000 in 1603. The population of Scotland and Ireland also reached 1.5 million in 1603, and the population of England also reached 4.1 million, growing from 2 million in 1500 to 3.01 million in 1551. It can be said that the population of England has grown explosively, which is also the main reason for North American immigration at that time. England's population was characterized by youths and infants under the age of 15, accounting for 38% of the total population. In order to feed these incapable people, it brings unbearable pressure to poor families with little land and little land. As a result, these families left their homes and begged everywhere, becoming one of the refugees. So having too many children is also a kind of suffering. At that time, orphans accounted for almost 1/5 of the minor population, especially those homeless orphans, which had become the biggest social problem in England. The next day, Edward, who had just woken up, hurriedly recruited Guy Ham, the first commander of the Dark Blade, and Guy has changed into the fancy clothes Edward gave him, trimmed his messy hair, and looks like a middle-aged handsome guy. Your Majesty the King, your loyal guard, Guy Ham, is here to pay his respects. Guy saluted Edward very politely. Well, Guy, you haven't eaten yet. Let's go together, Edward said with a friendly voice. This. Is it okay? Guy was a little at a loss. After all, this was his first time meeting with a nobleman, especially Edward, the largest nobleman in England. Of course, my dear sir, replied Edward. Please, Mr. Ham. At this time, Luna pulled out the chair in time and invited Guy. Sat on the chair with stiff limbs, his hands were shaking unconsciously, and his eyes looked around curiously, looking at the dishes on the long table in amazement. Roast goose exuding golden light, snow-white bread, black red fish sauce, an unknown roast pig that looks very appetizing, ruddy steak, a bottle of red wine from Orleans, France. All of these made Guy salivate so much that he forgot to start. Guy, why are you in a daze? Get ready. Yes, Your Majesty the King. Guy responded hastily as if he had been awakened. Of course, as usual, before eating, you must first pray to God. The old man. The time for praying was not long, and the time for eating was not too long, mainly because Lord Ham, who had just become the commander, ate too fast. In less than 10 minutes, the roast goose and half a roast suckling pig were finished. Edward was also affected and spent 20 minutes eating 3 pieces of bread and half a roast goose after breakfast. Edward took Guy to the study and started the first mission since Dark Blade was established. Edward sat on the chair next to the desk, leaning against a large bookshelf for prudence. There was a wide variety of books, which dazzled Guy's eyes. Since the 16th century, printing has gradually spread, and the price of books has continued to drop, but it is impossible for poor people like Guy to afford them. Even in his gentleman period before bankruptcy, he could only buy a few copies at most. Books. Guy stood respectfully in front of Edward, pretending to be listening attentively. Edward enjoyed Guy's respect very much, cleared his throat. Guy, I'm giving you a task now, and you must do your best to complete it. Seeing Edward's rare solemn expression, Guy had no choice but to follow the solemn expression and cheered up. Now, in addition to recruiting and expanding, you are doing your best to adopt orphans, whether they are male or female. I want them. Try to accept those under the age of 14. Edward added another sentence for fear that Guy would not work hard. This is the first test for you in the Dark Blade. Don't let me down. You will take the consequences at your own risk. Guy walked into David's restaurant in the western suburbs of London, saying it's a restaurant, rather than a food stall. David's restaurant is located in the western suburbs of London, adjacent to the Thames River. Small businessmen and travelers from all walks of life use this as a resting point, so there is a huge flow of people. It is good to be the temporary headquarters of the Night Angel. Hi, Mr. Ham. The little waiter Jack, who was busy entertaining the guests, didn't forget to say hello to Guy. Little Jack felt that Mr. Ham was a big man because one day he secretly saw Boss Robert, who was not in a hurry with his sir, nodding and bowing to Mr. Ham in a box. So with his 13 years of experience in observing words and expressions, he can guarantee that Mr. Ham must be a big shot. Jack hopes that he will leave a good impression in the eyes of Mr. Ham, and it may be a chance to change his destiny in the future. Thanks to 01234, Master Fan has spanned Aurora for 3,000 years. Graffiti TTY, Lily 559, GW 2579, Ye Fat's Happy Life, Ignorance is Not Wrong, Lancaster Coup, Book Friend 215 XXXX95, Zhuang Shu Iao, Minhang Menghua, everyone's big vote support. Your support is my greatest motivation. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 15, Dark Blade and number 039, S first meeting. Guy nodded to the little boy who greeted him, and went straight to the grocery store of the restaurant. After walking for a while, Guy came to their Dark Blades conference room, the grocery room. The room is located in the innermost part of the entire restaurant, and there is only one road around it, which is very remote, and there is a person guarding the gate specially, so the secrecy is very strong. Guy saw that the skinny Ed was on guard today, so he couldn't help but nodded to him and smiled at him. "Hey, boss. Well, watch the door carefully." "Okay." The thin Ed greeted Guy enthusiastically, and helped open the door. "By the way, boss." Guy walked straight in, and the noise in the room suddenly stopped, and more than 20 strong men inside shouted in unison. Guy has a high prestige among these people, and his words and deeds are unconsciously observed by the people present. The 20 or so people present were almost all recruited by Guy into the shadow, and it was Guy who gave these bankrupts a job to eat. Of course, this job is not very respectable, and there are always some people who can't bear it, and return to the countryside to be a gentleman's accountant, or to be a small peddler to find a job for themselves. However, bankrupt gentlemen like them don't bother to be accountants or small businessmen. They all have a very hopeless dream to restore the family, so they gathered around Guy to do the shameful work of thieves in order to please the king, working year after year without giving up for almost 10 years. Batch after batch of bankrupt gentlemen like them have come to the shadow, and batch after batch have left, only they persisted. Finally, with the accession of His Majesty Edward VI, they had their long-awaited opportunity. How can this not excite them? "Brothers, Our Majesty the King has sent us a mission." Guy looked at them. "This mission is our first mission, and it is His Majesty the King's test for us." As soon as Guy finished speaking, everyone who was standing loosely suddenly straightened up and started to get serious. "His Majesty the King asked us to adopt orphans, especially homeless orphans under the age of 14, regardless of gender." Guy said something that excited them. "The 3 people who adopt the most orphans this time will receive a reward of £10. They will also get 3 points of meritorious service." Guy ignored the noise of the people below, and said another news that could make them lose their breath. "In addition, His Majesty the King will personally promote you to be a centurion." Crash! More than 20 bankrupt gentlemen below cheered and jumped up in unison, and even the thin Ed who was on guard ran in and cheered together. The point system is a reward and punishment system customized by Edward for the Dark Blade. As long as you can complete the general tasks, you will get 10 acres of land if you accumulate 100 points. If you complete 10 tasks specific to His Majesty, you can get His Majesty's entrustment, become a knight. Of course, this is a court knight, without a fief. Only after being promoted to centurion and completing 10 specific tasks of the king can you own the fiefdom. Of course, this is the merit points for ordinary soldiers, but for the leaders above the centurion, as long as they complete 20 tasks issued by the king, they can be made knights by the king and have a village as a fiefdom. I also forgot to say that 1 point will be deducted for those who receive the task but do not complete it, and the king's specific task is mandatory to be completed, and 1 point will be deducted for the specific task if it is not completed. If 2 points are deducted, 1 level will be demoted. For example, the commander will be demoted to the deputy commander, the commander will be demoted to the deputy commander, and so on. This flexible mechanism can stimulate the subjective initiative of Dark Blade, so that it will not become rigid in the later stage like Jin Yue in Ming Dynasty. Another point is that he can continue to create a loyal knight class for Edward, laying the foundation for suppressing the bourgeoisie in the future. Of course, the army is the easiest to create a knight class, but Edward has not yet been in power, and the army is still controlled by the Regency Council, and he cannot surpass the Regency Council to recruit the army because the Regency Committee controls the army on behalf of the king. If he has any signs of contact, he will startle the snake and add a lot of trouble to the coup. 2 years later. Back to the topic. None of the gentlemen below has an official position, and only Guy has become the only commander among them. When they thought that they might become officials, they were so irritated that they couldn't help themselves, and the king's wise cheers rang out watching these people below change from their previous decadence and become full of energy one by one. Guy felt a sense of comfort in his heart. He recruited all these people in person one by one. Just like him, they are all bankrupt gentlemen families. Seeing them happy, he couldn't help but get excited. This must be the empathy. The whole day of Dark Blade was spent in excitement, and Guy went back to his little den, planning his mission. That's right, Guy's mission is different from theirs. His mission is to expand the number of Night Angels and recruit enough subordinates for His Majesty the King. Skinny Ed hurried back to his home full of excitement when his family went bankrupt. His wife did not abandon him, but used the money from selling the dowry to come to London with him and open a small grocery store. She could only fill her stomach in this London city, keep the wolf from the door. In the previous shadow period, Ed only received subsidies from the king to support the family's expenses when he had a mission, and bought some meat and clothes to improve his life. Ed stepped on the wooden floor lightly, past the grocery store on the first floor, and quickly past the old stairs to his bedroom. He looked around nervously, then closed the window uncomfortably, carefully took out a handful of silver coins, and counted them unconsciously. There were a total of 10 shillings in silver coins. Didn't feel anyone coming behind him at all. Aren't you very happy? Yes. Ed responded naturally. Ed turned his head unnaturally, and saw his wife Mary staring at him with round eyes with a playful expression on her face. Hi, Mary. Ed greeted timidly, seeing his wife like a mouse seeing a cat. As the so-called economic base determines the superstructure, it is obvious that his wife Mary is the head of the family. Of course, in this patriarchal society, Ed could easily regain control of the family, but he didn't, not only because Mary controlled the lifeline of the family, but also because she followed him to go bankrupt regardless of the consequences. From a gentleman's beautiful lady and gentleman's rich wife, she became a small businessman who was not much better than a poor man with him without hesitation. God worries about basic necessities of life. Hey, wife, this is my salary from His Majesty the King. Ed said with a smile, as if to prove himself. He said again, there will be every month in the future, and it is possible to restore our previous life. Ed couldn't help talking about Dark Blade's reward and punishment system to his wife. Thanks to Yaoxi, Suyuhua, Hizi, Yuli Efimovich Shelov, Lily 599, Master Fam for 3,000 years, Yefati's happy life, everyone's support. Chapter 16. Time to consider farming. Mary Walson, she is a beautiful and stubborn girl. She was born in a wealthy gentleman family, married Ed Walson from a gentleman family, and sold her dowry to save the family. She did not leave because of the decline of the family. Go Ed Walson. After hearing Ed's words, Mary was completely stunned. She never thought that she would have a chance to return to her original good life, and she might even become a knight class even after becoming the mother of 2 children. This stubborn girl never gave up the idea of returning to the upper class after experiencing many years of hardships. Therefore, Ed enjoyed the happiness of his wedding night on this night, and a sense of mastery and conquest rose in Ed's heart for a long time. He had never had such an idea and persistence in doing something. The early morning in London is filled with the smell of feces. It is because the merchants driving horses have come to the market to buy and sell goods, and the drunken big man defecates everywhere, and the poor people don't care about using the streets as toilets. This one event made up the filth and disorder of all London. Because of the rain just now, the disgusting yellow feces sewage flowed wantonly, and the pedestrians on the road walked as usual as if they didn't notice it, and the sewage slowly flows into the Thames, the mother river of London, along the gully. This is the cycle of nature. Ed had breakfast, and started to take a bulging wallet to the street far away from his home. Pretending to be casually wandering, Ed saw a stall selling shoes and hats full of exquisite clothing, and a butterfly-shaped little girl's shoe with pink and red edges on the stall caught Ed's gaze. At this moment, Ed couldn't help thinking that his eldest daughter was already 4 years old, and he hadn't given her a decent gift yet. Action is worse than heartbeat. Ed seemed to think of the happy look of his eldest daughter Yina when she saw the gift, and the corners of his mouth split open. The owner of the stall is an old man who can read his face. Seeing Ed wandering around in front of the stall, he introduced him to Ed consciously. Sir, you have a really good eye. This is made by the most famous Mrs. Aisha in London. Look at the color, how beautiful the needlework is. It's the most suitable gift for your daughter or niece. The boss, who was bald on one side, was chattering like a swarm of bees surrounding Ed's cerebral cortex. Sir, stop it. I know what you're talking about. Ed couldn't take it anymore, and quickly told the boss to stop. I just want to know how many cute silver coins this pair of cute little shoes cost. Ed's words made the old man a little embarrassed, but adhering to the businessman's principle of making money, the old man said the price helplessly. 1 shilling, sir, to take home these lovely shoes. Oh, God. Ed was shocked by the level of shamelessness of the boss. Even if he didn't bring a coin today, even if he did, he wouldn't pay such a high price. This is almost robbery. Hey, you bloody vampire, you actually asked me for 1 shilling for such a small pair of shoes. Do you know how much it is? Ed said angrily. Hey, dude, do you know that this is Mrs. Aisha's masterpiece? 1 shilling is already very cheap, and this is the only product I have. The boss argued unrelentingly. Ed, who was only arguing with the boss, didn't see a sneaky figure slowly approaching Ed, quietly without making a sound. Andre was an orphan. He was adopted by the church since he was a child. After the monastery he lived in was confiscated by His Majesty Henry VIII when he was 6 years old, he learned how to eat with those older children who were wandering on the streets. Over the past 6 years, he has stolen countless wallets, with failures and successes, but today, this fat sheep is a daredevil at first glance, and he even carries a bulging wallet with him on the street. Don't you know my little Andre's name on this street, huh? This is a newcomer. You deserve to be unlucky enough to meet me. While Andre approached Ed carefully, his heart was active. Andre looked at the two people who were constantly bargaining fiercely, and secretly put the knife in his small hand on the wallet. With a light swipe of the knife and a squeak, the wallet was in Andre's hands. Before he had time to be happy, suddenly a pair of big hands grabbed his little hand like giant pliers. Andre had only one feeling: I am in trouble today. Although Ed is thin, he is quite strong. Carrying Andre like a puppy, Andre shrank his neck, not daring to make any movements, like a kitten that just got wet in the rain, looking very pitiful. Don't pretend to be pitiful to me, little guy. Ed didn't care about arguing with the boss. He hurriedly picked up Andre, and walked into a small alley. I've seen a lot of people like you. Ed threatened from time to time, you'd better be obedient. Otherwise, you will be at your own risk. Andre didn't expect to meet an old driver. Oh no. As a veteran, I couldn't help but feel helpless. How could I be so unlucky? Andre just felt that he was thrown into the corner like a stone, so helpless. I heard that some people like to play with children, especially little boys. God bless me, little guy. Tell me, where is your stronghold? Ed suddenly broke Andre's fantasy, and asked another sentence that made Andre angry. Damn you, I won't tell you about our stronghold, you should die. Andre hates such traffickers the most. They not only sell girls into brothels, but also grow the Beijing boy sold to nobles and wealthy businessmen who have special hobbies. Little guy, you misunderstood. I am not a human trafficker. The king asked me to take you to the adoption home. Ed felt that the boy in front of him seemed to have misunderstood something, so he couldn't help explaining. Who doesn't understand your tricks? You can't fool me. Andre was not moved by Ed's words at all for the remaining half an hour. No matter what Ed said, he couldn't impress Andre. Okay. I swear in the name of God, if I tell you a lie, my soul will fall into hell and be ranked with Satan. In desperation, Ed used the oath to make Andre believe in himself. Okay. Let me trust you for now. Even though England carried out the religious reform, it only transferred the power of the Pope to the king, and it did not affect the people's belief in God at all. So after Ed swears with God, Andre kind of believes him. I saw Andre and Ed turning left and right to a dilapidated monastery with dozens of children between the ages of 3 and 14. Andre laughed happily when he saw this. These are all mine. The top 3 are expected. A month has passed, and the secret agents of the Dark Blade have brought nearly 3,000 orphans with their own abilities, and the efficiency is frighteningly high. But where there is sweetness, there is bitterness. No, Manager Luna is here to complain. Your Majesty, the food stored in Windsor Castle is not enough for a month. Edward patted his forehead and couldn't help sighing. It's time to start farming. Thanks to the divine sculpture of heaven, I see me conquering. Lancaster Ku, Zhuangshu Iao, funeral, Yi, Xingchen, Fenyu has spanned Aurora for 3,000 years. Lily 599, everyone's big vote support. Your support is my greatest encouragement. Chapter 17 Reforms in the New Situation. When Edward was troubled by the lack of food due to the large number of adopted people, our Lord Regent, the Lord Protector, the Duke of Somerset, was discussing a new reform bill with the ministers before Henry VIII died. He appointed an auxiliary team for Edward. Among them were conservatives. For example, Queen Catherine's younger brother, Duke William Parr, was a typical conservative and one of the 3 abstentions in the Regency Council. The reformers are the biggest force, such as Edward Seymour, who added the title of Duke and Protector to himself, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, who is against the Duke, and Canterbury, who has always pretended to be a transparent person, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and so on, and so on. The Duke of Somerset is a radical Protestant. He believes that the religious reform in England is not thorough, and it still retains the Catholic layer. For example, he believes that the current Anglican religion believes in a kind of Catholicism without a pope. This is a thorn in the throat of a Protestant like him, and it has reached a level of unhappiness. Therefore, the Duke of Somerset has always wanted to reform England's religion according to the continental model, and give England and Wales a thorough baptism. Gentlemen, we can no longer bear England being exploited by the Pope in Rome. His Excellency the Duke snapped. It's time to give those hypocrites a hard blow. It seemed that they were shocked by the Duke's voice, or they didn't care at all. All the ministers who were working fell silent, showing a kind of majestic and immobile demeanor. The atmosphere suddenly became solemn, like the time before the heavy rain. The whole air was filled with oppressive atmosphere, making people feel uncomfortable, and it was difficult to breathe after saying these words. His Excellency the Duke's eyes could not help but glance over the crowd, and then he closed his eyes tightly, like a candle. Although motionless, it was still so dazzling in the dark. Some ministers closed their eyes, looking rested. Some ministers looked up at the murals on the Duke's mansion, as if they were cultivating their sentiments. Some played with the rings on their hands, as if they didn't hear the Duke's words. A little bit of time passed, and no one had the intention to speak first. Even in the morning, the light in the room seemed even dimmer. Your Excellency, the Duke of Somerset, is right. We can no longer let the rotten degenerates of Rome dictate to England, which is thousands of miles away. The Earl of Warwick was the first to break the silence, and his rough voice brought the wondering ministers back to the conference room. The air that was stagnant just now seemed to be alive at once, and even the sunlight coming in from the window felt much warmer. Unknowingly, many ministers shouted and complained to express their resistance to the church, and the entire conference room was filled with pleasant noises. The Duke of Somerset, who was sitting upright, nodded slightly to the Earl of Warwick, his eyes calm. The Earl of Warwick also slightly nodded his head to the Duke's overture, and showed a smile that was half-skinned. The Earl actually hated the Duke of Somerset very much, especially when he saw his expression of being in control of everything. The Earl wanted to use his wide thick cocoon palm to make intimate contact with his face just when the atmosphere was about to reach its climax. Duke Parr, who had been silent all this time, suddenly stood up from his chair. Everyone stopped their noisy voices immediately, and they all raised their heads to look at the Duke of Parr, and a voice almost sounded in their hearts, finally made a move. The Duke of Parr looked at the people who were looking at him, without any fluctuation in his heart, and said in a thick voice, "Our priests in England have severed ties with that decaying church in Rome, and they also it is impossible to have the opportunity to dictate to us. So, as the shepherds sent by the Lord to England to guide the lost lambs, we don't need to let them change anymore. Everything is still good now." Duke Parr's words were resounding and shocked the ministers present. The ministers, including the Duke of Somerset, did not expect that the Duke of Parr, who had always remained silent, had such a side. "You can't say that, my dear Duke. Who can guarantee that those priests who still use Roman standards don't have a trace of nostalgia for Rome?" Duke Seymour knew that it was his turn to act. The Duke of Parr was still not very good at words. His mouth was choked by the Duke's words, and he could not utter a word of rebuttal. He is not God, so how can he know what those priests are thinking? Because of such a sentence, Duke Paul sat back helplessly, and returned to his previous taciturn state. It seems that the Duke of Northampton also knows the truth of being outnumbered, and it should be the last effort just now. Another round of voting followed, and, as expected, 13 of the 16 voted in favor and only 3 voted against. The Duke of Seymour passed the decision to carry out more in-depth reforms to the Church of England with crushing votes. No matter what feelings the reformers present had in their hearts, their faces were all filled with happy and joyful expressions. The ministers represented by the Duke of Parr left the conference room with indifference, while the many ministers who were happily discussing the reform plan didn't care at all. Leaning on crutches, the Duke of Northampton walked slowly towards the carriage in the Duke's mansion. After leaving the brightly lit meeting room, His Excellency could still see all kinds of vague figures arguing fiercely from the window. Snort. "A gang of thieves who only want to steal their property. My poor William is in trouble again." Duke Parr's second son, William Parr, went to church according to the rules at the time. From a small priest, through the management of the Duke of Parr and his own efforts, he quickly became the Archbishop of Dorset. The eldest son, Bud Parr, will succeed him as the Duke of Northampton, and his most beloved second son, William Parr, was managed by him to become the bishop. Who knows that he has survived the clutches of Henry VIII with difficulty, and now faces a new crisis. The Duke of Northampton was helped into the magnificent carriage by the groom, and walked home amidst the groom's shouts. At this time, our King Edward is coming to the manor near Windsor Castle to be entertained by the butler here. Your Majesty, please come with me. I have prepared a comfortable room for you." Edward was greeted warmly by the butler as soon as he got off the carriage. Hundreds of serfs, both male and female, were kneeling in front of the manor, and more than 20 little devils were held down by their parents. Obviously, the butler's action greatly shocked Edward, and made Edward, who had always thought that the West could only kneel on one knee, raise his posture. It turns out that as long as the power is in place, there is nothing that cannot be achieved. "Thank you, Minhang Menghua, Meteor Emperor," rang deity. "Ignorance is not wrong, Master Fan has been in Aurora for 3,000 years. Lily 599. Everyone for your support. Chapter 18. My land listens to me. This was the first time for Edward to see a group of people kneeling in front of him without reservation. Even though he had seen thousands of people kneeling before the Emperor on TV, he personally felt that this was the first time. This feeling is very wonderful, giving Edward the pleasure of completely controlling the fate of others. This feeling is very strange. People are addicted to it unconsciously, but after a while, Edward from this feeling got over. Is this how ancient Chinese emperors felt when facing their subjects? No wonder so many people are scrambling to get that seat. It's really fascinating. Edward followed Howard Charles, the housekeeper of the manor, as he walked past the serfs prostrating on the muddy ground step by step, thinking slowly. The butler Howard Charles is the second son of a noble knight. Not only did he lose his right of inheritance since he was a child, but he is also too thin to be a wandering knight. He can only work as a butler in order to gain status and survive. Howard Charles is relatively thin. The hair on his head is combed, shiny and meticulous. His height is relatively moderate. His eyes are in a straight line. His cheeks are slightly concave. He looks like a shrewd person. Edward and Howard walked in front, followed by sisters Elizabeth and Luna, and of course Baron Smith and 20 knights. Why did Elizabeth follow? According to her explanation, it was to protect Edward. This sentence made Edward speechless, but when he remembered that she was often bored in the palace, Edward couldn't help but agreed. So when Elizabeth jumped up excitedly, Edward made a contract with her for 3 chapters. First, you can't go out without Edward's approval. Second, you must listen to Edward's words when you go out, and don't disobey them. Third, do not tell anyone what happened outside. If Elizabeth violates any of the above 3 rules, she will be sent back to Windsor Castle immediately and will not be allowed to go out for a year. With Elizabeth's lips pursed angrily, Edward made the deal with her. Your Majesty, our Windsor Manor is currently cultivating about 1,200 acres. Howard's voice was full of magnetism. Not only do we have 53 adult laborers and 56 children under the age of 14, we also breed 20 acres, 4 draft horses and 136 sheep, and the mill in the manor can earn £100 a year by crushing wheat grains for the nearby villagers every year. At this time, it is impossible for ordinary farmers to own mills, and they can only use them at the expense of those who own them. For example, Newton accompanied his grandma to the mill and saw the windmill mill, so he built a small mill by himself. At this time, the people who owned mills were either nobles or big gentlemen in the local area. The ordinary gentlemen and self-cultivating farmers had no conditions to run them by themselves, and besides feeding and drinking to the serfs, we generate a total income of £1,500 every year. Howard's voice was full of pride. Edward could understand Howard's pride, because at that time, such a large manor usually only made a profit of £1,200 a year, but he abruptly increased it by £300, which was enough to prove his ability. Then Mr. Steward, how much food can we harvest in a year? Edward is now immune to money, but he is short of food, so he couldn't help raising the question of food. Your Majesty the King, at present, 100 acres of wheat have been planted, and about 700 bushels have been harvested. 800 acres of rye have been planted, and 11,200 bushels have been harvested. 200 acres of oats have been planted, and 1,200 bushels have been harvested. Soybeans have been planted on 100 acres, harvested 458 bushels. Immediately, a series of numbers shot out of Butler Howard's mouth like a machine gun. In England, a bushel equals 8 gallons, which equals 4 pecks. UK unit of volumetric measurement, which equals 36.3688 liters. Metric. To put it bluntly, 1 bushel is equal to 36.3688 kilograms, which is about 73 kilograms if converted into measure we are familiar with. Take rye, which has the largest yield, as an example, about 1,100 caddies per acre. This is the net yield, and it is also the highest yield recorded at this time according to the calculation that 1 acre is equal to 6 mu. 1 mu can only produce about 170 caddies. At that time, the yield per mu in Shanxi, which was barren in the Ming dynasty, reached 300 caddies, and the yield per mu in Jiangnan area at that time even reached 500 caddies. Desperate numbers of people because of the frighteningly low yield of this plant in England. The time for crops is generally to plant grains such as barley in autumn, and to harvest them in the next summer, which spans more than half a year. So this is why the population of the entire European continent is smaller than that of the Ming dynasty, and the arable land area is more than that of the Ming dynasty. But the price of food is high and there is not enough food. Edward came to Windsor Manor today to guide the work. So when Elizabeth returned to the villa in the manor to rest, Edward came to the farmland under the scorching sun at noon. It was only a short distance of about 1 kilometer to the farmland, and Edward was already very tired. Although he was not in good health, Edward could only endure silently in order to maintain the majesty of the king. Edward looked at a vast field. 2 fields showed different scenes. One was already filled with the smell of green wheatgrass, while the other side was still bare and full of weeds. Edward knew that this was the 2-field farming method popular in Europe. The 2-field system is one of the crop rotation methods popular in Europe since the Middle Ages. It was prevalent in Europe before the 18th century AD. The method is to divide the arable land into 2 parts. One part is cultivated every year, and the other part is fallow, and they are replaced year by year to maintain the fertility of the land, and the crops are also rotated. And Edward looked at the wheat field without saying a word, feeling deeply moved in his heart. I am here today because knowledge determines destiny, and knowledge can change history. Edward turned his head to look at Butler Howard, who was following behind him, and said, "Howard, have you heard of the 3-yard system?" "Ah, Your Majesty, I've never heard of this word. Does it have anything to do with the 2-yard system?" Butler Howard was a little puzzled by Edward's words. The 3-field system is that it divides the cultivated land into 3 cultivated areas: the fallow land, the spring-sown land, and the autumn-winter sowed land with approximately equal areas. Crops are also rotated across zones, with spring crops either barley or oats or beans, and autumn-winter crops either wheat or rye. Cultivated land and crops are rotated year by year, with a 3-year cycle. In the feudal manner, the 3-field system was enforced. The cultivated land owned by farmers is in the form of long and narrow strips of land, scattered alternately with land reserved by the lords in each cultivated area. The types of crops planted each year and the farming time are mandatory, and farmers have no right to range them. The fallow land and the cultivated land after harvesting are used as public pastures for common use. Compared with a 2-field system, the 3-field system can be harvested twice a year, and the area of fallow land is reduced from 1/2 to 1/3, which is not only conducive to reducing the risk of agricultural disasters or poor harvests, but also conducive to the utilization of cultivated land and labor force. The rate of increase. So the level of agricultural production is higher than the 2-garden system. Howard, I decided to implement the 3-field system here. Edward said something that surprised Howard. "But Your Majesty." Howard was interrupted by Edward when he was about to say something. "Don't say anything more. My land listens to me, thanks to its people." 1111, 01234, RI 599. Chapter 19. Visiting parents. Edward's domineering words made Howard speechless. Yes. He is the owner of the manor. If he loses money, why should I worry about it here? Isn't this a good man for nothing? Butler Howard thought for a while, and finally stopped what he was going to say, feeling a little unhappy in his heart, bored beside Edward, staring straight at Edward, without saying a word. "Please, Howard, I am confident. You have to trust me." Edward couldn't stand being stared at by the housekeeper. If a beautiful woman is okay, but when an adult man in his 30s looks at you with sad eyes, you will feel like a fucking dog. Edward understood Howard's mood quite well. It's like a person who usually seems to know nothing, suddenly one day said to an English teacher that you don't want to teach. "Let me do it, I can teach better than you." When this teacher still wanted to resist, he said that the whole school is mine. "You don't want BB then." That teacher's mood is what Butler Howard feels at this moment. If he replaced it with his body, Edward would probably have scolded him hundreds of times in his stomach. However, Edward also has his own difficulties. If there is no need for power, how many people will listen to his explanation and do what they think is wrong without hesitation? It is better not to explain than to explain. "My dear Butler, don't worry." Edward comforted the whining Butler Howard. "Now the royal family has a new source of income. The lovely gold coins have filled the granary, and now our food is gone." Edward's exaggerated words did not make the butler laugh, but made his brows furrow even more. How did Edward know that Howard was not actually worried about the loss of the manor's grain? The entire royal family didn't know how much land was planted with grain, and there would be no shortage of grain from this manor. Instead, he was worried that Edward would destroy his carefully planned manor development plan, just like destroying the snowmen piled up by children. It was full of his painstaking efforts. Edward seized the time to take a break while speaking, allowing his overwhelmed body to take a breath. Holding on to his desire to rest, Edward slowly came to the field ridge, looked at the fallow land and said, "My dear housekeeper, don't you think it's a waste to harvest such a large land with only these grains? My respected Majesty the King, are you doubting my management level? Howard suddenly raised his voice, with some anger in his voice, and an indescribable expression on his face. No. 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 I don't have any doubts about your management level. Edward was very calm and unmoved by the butler's rhetorical question. I'm just worried about the current food production. Edward said suddenly with a hint of sentimentality. Your Majesty the King. I don't know what caused you to worry. Howard quickly calmed down the fluctuations in his heart. His voice became calmer at night, and he offered his loyalty in a timely manner, and there was a hint of excitement in his words. If there is anything I need to do, I am willing to serve you. Your Majesty the King. Oh. Howard, your loyalty has made the sun in the sky lose its light. Edward's praise sounded at the right time, praising the butler's loyal heart. Although I don't know if it's true or not, but please tell me how many families and children there are in the manor. In fact, Howard has already said it once, but he will do it again under the circumstances. Yes. Your Majesty the King. Butler Howard once again returned to his strict appearance. There are 18 families in our manor, 17 unmarried boys and girls, and 56 children who can't support themselves. Then there are almost 3 children per household? Yes, Your Majesty. Then you are telling me the population of the entire Windsor Manor 10 years ago? Well, there are about 60 people. The butler pondered for a while, and then said a vague number. Howard, think about it. The population of the manor has almost doubled in 10 years, so what about the whole of England? Edward said this with a hint of excitement in his tone. The population has doubled, but the land and yield per mu have not increased much, so the price of food will skyrocket. Think about how big a business opportunity this is. If I use my method, our land will increase by 5 layers per mu. How much income will this bring to the royal family? Edward's words successfully brought Howard Butler into the fantasy stage. I have 50 acres of land, and adding 5 layers to the acre would bring in an extra income of almost £50 a year at a price of 1.5p a pound. The power of money also moved the always rigorous Butler Howard, so he began to cooperate with Edward seriously at this time. Among the thatched houses where the serfs lived in the manor, a house that looked cleaner and tidy than the surrounding mud houses was full of people coming and going. Little Jack happily held the bird eggs he had just picked out from the tree, looking forward to eating delicious boiled eggs with his 5-year-old brother Lammy at night, and happily walked towards his home with his short legs. Run away, Jack. Go back quickly, your sister has returned home from the palace. On the way, little Jack ran into his neighbor's friend Muir, who dragged Jack towards Jack's house while explaining to Jack, hey, Muir, let's see if you can run past me. Jack knew that after his sisters came back, he couldn't bear Muir's slow speed, so he hurriedly broke away from Muir's hand. Gee, Jack, who in the entire Windsor Manor doesn't know about your monkey, Jack, who can outrun you? Muir followed Jack panting, and said helplessly behind. In a short while, Jack saw dozens of adults surrounded by the door of his house. They were whispering and chatting about some happy topics, showing some happy and envious expressions from time to time. Let's see who's back. People seemed to have seen him, and they all rushed towards him, and surrounded Jack in the center of the crowd. Jack, don't forget Uncle Rick. Don't forget Aunt Bella. Suddenly, a sound of pleading surrounded Jack, and little Jack was completely dizzy regardless of everyone's compliments. Jack hurriedly left the crowd and walked into his home. As soon as I opened the door, I saw 2 teenage girls in bright clothes chatting happily with their parents. It's Jack, come here. Seeing that little Jack seemed a little embarrassed, Luna summoned the wondering Jack. Jack walked slowly to his younger brother, looking at his 2 older sisters shyly. Thank you, Juan Shu Iao. It's a joke. A lot of support. Chapter 20. The toilet problem. Jack looked at the 2 well-dressed older sisters in front of him, and he couldn't help revealing a special hate in his heart, which immediately spread all over his body. Jack didn't know what it was, but an idea suddenly popped up in his brain. Wanting to be an enviable person like the 2 sisters wearing brocade clothes, he returned home flaunting his might, and became the object of discussion among the neighbors. It's just that the idea that just popped up was suddenly washed away by the information from the brain. His father and mother were serfs, and his whole family were serfs, including him as the king's private property. It is impossible for him to be respected by people. He will only marry a serf in the future and become a person like his father. The passion in Jack's eyes came and went quickly, and calm was restored in an instant. At this time, Lucy looked at Jack in great surprise. In the blink of an eye, the short-legged little guy who had been chasing after her had grown into a 10-year-old boy, and she and her sister had been away from home for 5 years. Luna and Lucy are very concerned about their parents and younger brothers who haven't seen each other for 5 years. When I first arrived at Windsor Manor, I hurried to the place where I lived when I was a child before I had time to rest. It may be that the two sisters have become His Majesty's maids. The housekeeper deliberately eased the labor difficulty of the father and mother, making their faces much rosier than ordinary serfs, and they are more energetic. Although Howard's intentions are more obvious, she still has the essentials for this favor. Luna looked at her younger brother Jack, who had just come back. He was covered in mud and covered in black-gray long-sleeved sackcloth, and his brown hair was no exception. The thin arms looked distressing. However, Jack's lively appearance still made Luna feel relieved a lot. Jack, you are already an adult, and you need to help your parents with more work in the future to reduce the burden. And, sister, I will. I usually take care of little Remy. Jack nodded fiercely, and showed off his credit like Luna asking for credit. Yes, Jack is already a great labor force in our family. He should be rewarded. Luna took out a candy from Edward in her pocket and put it in Jack's hand. Jack saw that Luna grabbed a handful of small things wrapped in paper and carefully placed them in your hands. Although he didn't know what it was, Jack knew it was a good thing when he saw the cherished expressions on his sister's face. Jack, this is the candy given to me by His Majesty the King. You and Lemmy should eat it slowly, and don't eat too much at once. It's not good for your teeth. Luna babbled again. Jack quickly opened the wrapping paper, took out one and put it into the mouth of little Remy, who was curled up in Lucy's arms, and then took out another one and put it in his own mouth almost at the same time. The two little guys narrowed their eyes, parted their peeling lips, and became happy together when the mother Gina next to her saw that Luna took out the small thing wrapped in beautiful leather paper. She knew it must be a valuable item, especially when she heard that it was a gift from the king to the Luna sisters. Her fragile heart couldn't help but quicken. Luna, this is a gift from His Majesty the King. It will be fine if you give it to Jack. Luna saw her mother's weathered face full of worry, and her father beside her also had a look of worry. A look of approval. It's okay, mother. His Majesty the King has a very good temper, so I won't blame this little thing. Lucy, who was focused on teasing little Remy, couldn't help but rush to reply. Hearing Lucy's words, the wrinkled strong man and the weathered woman revealed a slight brilliance. Father, His Majesty the King came here this time because there is a big event to be done. Tell the uncles and aunts in the whole manor to do things seriously. Don't worry, Luna. Now I have been appointed as the supervisor by the butler, and everyone will listen to me. Luna's father, old Jack, smirked at the side, very satisfied with his position. The conversation is divided into two parts. On one side, Luna's family is happily reunited, while on the other side, Edward's brainwashing of Butler Howard has initially achieved results. After Edward's continuous explanations and the induction of interests, Howard has promised to give the green light to Edward's experiment, and will work hard to fulfill Edward's needs. Of course, the most important thing is that Edward has played a trump card, promising to give Howard 50 acres of land after the experiment is successful, and he can become the Minister of Agriculture in the future. Sure enough, the old ancestor's words are correct. In the affairs of the world, the prosperity of the world is for the benefit, and the hustle and bustle of the world is for the benefit. Even Edward, as a king, couldn't make Howard, a local snake, bow his head. But as soon as he revealed the real interests of land and the temptation of the Minister of Agriculture, one of the best official positions in the future, the rigorous Howard immediately knelt down. Edward knew that he had no majesty in the heart of the butler, and only his interests could make him seriously work for himself. But the current feudal rules can only make him obey and cannot exert his subjective initiative. Edward watched the work of the serfs for a while. The rye in the wheat field just absorbs a little more nutrition. Edward watched for a while, finished talking with Howard, and was led back to the manor villa by the butler. There is nothing special about this villa, except that the toilet is very large. This villa was built during the period of Henry VIII, and in almost all the manors and territories, Henry VIII took the trouble to spend a lot of money to build villas and castles. Why is this? This mainly starts with the construction of castles. Since the Middle Ages, the period at that time was similar to that of China's Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. The countries and lords in various places were relatively small in size and small in population, so castles with European characteristics were built. It sacrifices space for the defensive power it needs, so it has excellent defensive capabilities. At that time, because the various nobles often fought, the population dropped sharply, so the castle at that time was enough to accommodate the people living in the castle. Since the unification of the Tudor dynasty in England, most areas have ushered in a rare period of peace. As the saying goes, there is nothing to do but sleep after eating. This sleep is so bad that the population of England has almost doubled in less than 50 years. For example, London at that time had only 30,000 people in 1500, but by 1550, 100,000 people had emerged in the entire city. The huge population hoarded in London, resulting in blocked sewers and overcrowded housing. As a result, the citizens of London almost lived in a circle surrounded by excrement and urine, and the people at that time had no quality to speak of. If you were not careful walking on the street, you would be injured by the excrement falling from the sky. As for Henry VIII's repair of villas and castles, he can understand that he is allowing the entire royal court to have a place to excrete, so as to save the palace's toilet from being exploded. Thanks to book friend 215XXXX15, WL Future, Master Fan has traversed Aurora for 3,000 years. Yuri Yefimovich Shelov, 56,548,912, Lily 599, book friend Juan, Scholar Bureaucrat 007, Hanbings IAE, book friend 219XXXX60, everyone votes support. Chapter 21 Interesting toilet anecdote. It was already a month before Henry VIII's death. Since Edward knew why he had been living in castles all over the place, it is conceivable that more than 500 people in the entire royal court, including the palace guards, have been staying in Windsor Castle. The excrement of so many people almost flooded the entire castle. When Sister Luna told Edward the news, he was totally taken aback, and when he saw that his bedroom door was almost flooded, Edward could no longer describe his mood. All the people in Windsor Castle were gathered by Edward, organized to clean up together, pack up their excrement and dumped it in a large pit dug in advance. This big pit is unusual, 10 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 5 meters high. There are also 50 large wooden stakes with a length of 6 meters and a diameter of 30 centimeters inserted in the middle. It took 300 guards half a morning to cut these wooden posts. Edward also laid planks over the stakes to keep the stench from escaping. In this way, a urinal is formed, and all future excrement can be poured into it. Edward didn't want it to last for a few years, he just needed to survive Henry VIII. In fact, it not only survived Henry VIII, but also survived 1548, until Edward seized power. The real flush toilet wasn't invented until the late 18th century, and it wasn't until the Victorian era in the 19th century that modern toilets became a standard feature in most homes in Britain. In the long Middle Ages, how did Europeans excrete? Where does the exported waste go? The answer is, whatever. In the early Middle Ages, the towns in Europe were still quite small, and people either defecated on the streets, or put them in buckets and poured them into the streets or rivers. In sparsely populated villages, internal urgency is even more unrestrained. However, an unwritten rule is a place of a stone's throw, which means that the place to solve the problem must be at least one distance away from the nearest residence. It is unimaginable to build a toilet at home. Getting too close to neighbors while unloading, or even working indoors, is seen as provocative and disruptive behavior. As the ruler of England, Henry VIII was quite worried about the urinal problem. In 1513, Henry was so sick of the ugly brown stains on the outside walls of his private chambers that he ordered the steward of the Tower of London to build a hollow column or radiator to cover up the filthy Earl's Castle. In Ghent, Belgium, is a representative of the castle's private rooms. The living area has a den that can only accommodate one person. The alcoves on the fortress walls were reserved for the less privileged inhabitants. The substances of the above two conveniences flowed into the river next to the city wall. Using the toilets on the wall in the cold winter is a horrible experience, and many people's buttocks are frozen on the stone rings. The early London Bridge was not like the two tall towers facing each other now, but a crowded river town full of houses. Residents on London Bridge also have to solve their personal problems. The public toilets here are thrown directly into the Thames River. If the sailors passing under the bridge dare to look up at the London sky at a 45-degree angle, they will probably eat it. That's why there is a proverb that says, "A wise man crosses over a bridge, and a fool under a bridge." The only moment of relief for those who had to cross under the bridge was when the bomber above accidentally fell into the river from the latrine. As a nobleman, Edward doesn't have to worry about going to the toilet, but how to wipe after using is also very important. Can you imagine what it's like to wipe your ass with a sackcloth? Very sour. But at this point, Edward is much more comfortable than the French king. In ancient Rome, a stick wrapped with cotton cloth was used, which is the Roman toilet chip. The toilet chip in public toilets is shared, and it is put into a container for disinfection and cleaning when it is used up. The most interesting thing is that in France at the end of the Middle Ages, thick hemp rope was used to wipe buttocks in the palace. This rope was hung from the roof of the luxurious toilet, just hanging next to the squatting position after shitting, Put the rope through the middle of the legs, pull it with one hand in the front, and pull it with the other hand in the back, like a big saw, rubbing the buttocks. What's more, this rope is shared. The emperor used it up and the queen used it. When the empress ran out of favorites, she used that one and did not change it all year round. To reflect the unity of the monarch and his ministers, Edward was wearing ordinary aristocratic uniforms, including a purple robe. Because it rained in the morning, there was still some humidity in the air. Edward also wore a woolen sweater inside. In England, because of the centralized power of the king, the power of the royal family is different from that of the previous kings. For example, England stipulates that only members of the royal family can wear gold and purple clothing, and even nobles cannot wear it like this. Edward walked ahead step by step, thinking about the interesting things he saw in the forum, and Howard followed step by step. The two guards behind him were 2 steps away from Edward, and the serfs on both sides gave way consciously. It didn't disturb the temperament of these nobles in the slightest. Suddenly, Edward felt a vibration from the left, and then a sound of horseshoes reached his ears. It was Edward's first feeling that someone was coming on horseback. Sure enough, when Edward looked up, he saw that Princess Elizabeth had changed into casual clothes, riding her brown-red mare Sally gallantly, like fiery red paint poured on the green drawing board, which was very eye-catching. Elizabeth's voice like a wind chime came from a distance, accompanied by the crowing of the mare, like a knight returning from an expedition, full of confidence and joy. It was rare for Edward to see Elizabeth so happy, and an urge to ride a horse surged in his heart. Jackson. Where's my Arthur? Edward turned his head to look at his young bodyguard, William, a relatively thin guy. Oh, Your Majesty, isn't your Arthur behind Princess Elizabeth? William pointed weakly behind Elizabeth, and replied cautiously. Then Edward saw a scene that made him almost lose his face. I saw a small white spot behind Elizabeth. If someone with good eyesight looked carefully, he could see that it was a little pony running happily behind. When Elizabeth approached him, Edward saw Arthur sticking out his little tongue, wagging his snow-white tail, and running happily with his mouth wide open, following Elizabeth like a little follower. Moreover, Edward also saw Elizabeth throwing something backward from time to time, and the little pony lowered its head from time to time, and knew it must be something to eat. Without looking, soon, Elizabeth rode to Edward's side, sitting as proud as a swan, sitting motionless on the horse and passing Edward. And the little pony seemed to have seen Edward, and slowly stopped moving its calf, and came to Edward's side cautiously. With a very funny expression on his flattering expression, thanks to Yuri Yefimovich Serov, Lancaster Ku, Xinghao, Minhang Menghua, Lily 599, Zhuang Shu Iao, Master Fan has been in Aurora for 3,000 years. Let's joke, everyone supports you. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 22: The Knight from Afar. When Arthur saw Edward, he walked over slowly, looked up at the direction where Elizabeth was going away, seemed to think for a while. Maybe he still felt that the long-term meal ticket was important, shook the pony's head, and said cheerfully, "Run up to Edward." Edward looked at the shameless little guy in front of him. It seemed that what Elizabeth fed hadn't filled his stomach yet. Cheeky came to Edward's hand, and slowly licked Edward's wide and tender palm with his tongue. "Hey, can you show some face?" Edward said helplessly. Both hands unconsciously ravaged Arthur's long pony face, rubbing vigorously, interactively from left to right, without repetition. Woo! Woo! The little pony Arthur was rubbed by Edward so that the pony's face stood up, as if he was impatient with Edward. He stuck out his tongue and screamed, "HMPH! Let you eat and crawl, and you will be tempted out by a little food." "Ah!" Edward said. The strength in his hands was much weaker, but he still didn't let go of his hands. "You are not allowed to come out casually in the future, you know? I'll take it as if you know and agree." Edward immediately let go of his hand, and led the pony slowly back to the villa in the center of the manor. The villa covers an area of about 20 acres, and has about 30 rooms on the upper and lower floors. The sculpture in front of the door is a portrait of an angel with spread wings. It is about 6 feet high. The wings were about 3 feet long on each side, and 2 feet at their widest point. The angel spread its wings, put its hands together in its abdomen, and showed a kind expression on its face. Of course, as in the Western form, the angel is in the center of a fountain, and a pool about a foot high guards the angel. A female angel in a white robe, surrounded by erupting water vapor, appeared in front of Edward at a height reaching the height, and Edward had to look up to the beautiful angel. Edward is about 4 feet tall, while the angel's total height reaches 9 feet. Edward can only see the angel's waist when he looks up. Having said that, I have to talk about the weights and measures in England. Inches originally meant the width of your thumb. The name comes from the Latin uncia, which means 1/12. 1 inch is considered the width of a thumb in England. Inches have been used since the Middle Ages. In 1324, Edward II decreed that an inch was the length of 3 barley grains joined. The inch is the basis of the imperial unit of length and is now legally equal to 2.54 centimeters. This means that imperial units of length are based on the metric system. If you want to do a quick conversion, 2 inches is about 5 centimeters. The foot is equal to 30.48 centimeters under the metric conversion, and under the imperial conversion, 12 inches equals 1 foot, 3 feet equals 1 yard. And there is an old story about the origin of feet in England. Sit down, everyone, Langer's story will start. This is an uplifting gesture. A long time ago, there was a country called Rome, and the Roman unit at that time was called pes, and the plural was pedes, which means foot, which is 29.59 centimeters, which is very close to the modern feet. Also 12 inches is 1 piece. Since England was conquered by the Roman Empire, England has been crying and resisting, while unconsciously using it. So feet have been used in England. For details, please refer to modern Japan. Feet have been used in England for over 1,000 years. Foot also means foot. The length of a human foot used to be anywhere from 9¾ inches to 19 inches. My foot is 11 inches. The modern meaning of feet and inches was not established until the 1844 reorganization standard. That year, the British government produced standard yard lengths in bronze, divided into feet and inches. Edward's neck was sore when he looked up, and he could barely see the face of this angel sister. As always, kind, gentle, and not irritating. After reading it, Arthur handed it over to William, the guard, and told him to feed less fodder. It had already eaten a lot today. Arthur cried to death and didn't expect that it put all its heart and soul into licking Edward, and sacrificed its handsome face. It still hadn't appeased Edward, and the result of reducing the amount of food was still inevitable. Edward went back to his room, changed his clothes, went to the study, and read a book. Boom. Come in, Edward said without raising his head when he heard the knock on the door. Your Majesty. It's time for dinner. Lucy, wearing a maid outfit, carefully pushed open the door of the study, revealing a lovely face. Got it. Edward agreed casually, still staring at the parchment in his hand. Your Majesty, if you do this again, I'll tell Aunt Anna to see what you do. Lucy frowned and moved her smooth nose. She was really helpless by Edward's ruffian appearance and could only move out. Aunt Anna came to shock him. Lucy, how can you bother Aunt Anna with such a small matter? Edward immediately expressed that he was defeated by Lucy. I'll go right away and lead the way. Edward tidied up his books and placed a goose feather on the pages he read before, carefully placing them on the bookshelf. Soon, Edward followed Lucy to the dining room, while Elizabeth and Howard the butler were already seated, waiting boredly. Edward, why are you? Elizabeth said loudly. When she realized that there were outsiders, she stopped in the middle of her speech, and her neck and ears were flushed red. Obviously, she also knew that it was rude for outsiders to yell like this, and it was not in line with a lady's demeanor. Howard, what is this? Edward pointed to a plate of roasted leg meat and said at the right time, which just rightly eased Elizabeth's embarrassment. Your Majesty, this is a dough brought by the serfs of the manor. I specially asked the cook to make it for you, Your Majesty. The King Henry VIII is a king who likes hunting, and he often leads a group of nobles to hunt horses. Period. And these serfs also had the opportunity to accompany the king to hunt together, and the heroic serfs had the opportunity to receive bows and arrows from Henry VIII. Of course, it was mainly Edward who issued a royal decree at the end of February, allowing people to go hunting and chop firewood freely in the forests belonging to the royal family. Edward is mainly doing this to give the poor people a way of life in winter. This is also a trick to buy people's hearts. However, Edward also ruled against shooting pregnant mother animals in the spring, as well as underage juvenile animals. No trees less than 1 inch thick shall be felled. I don't know that this alone has bought a lot of hearts for Edward. Edward was tasting the roasted deer, when suddenly Lucy whispered in his ear, Your Majesty, a wandering knight asks to see you. Thank you. Su Yuhua, Prussian nobleman, Han Bing Ziae, Zhuang Shu Iao. You are kidding me. Everyone's support. Chapter 23. Grenville Richard. What? How does he know I'm here? No. He's asking to see the owner of the manor. Oh. Then you can serve him a dinner first. I'll go see him after eating. Yes. After seeking Edward's opinion, Lucy lifted her skirt to Elizabeth and Howard, bent over, and slowly exited the restaurant. Lucy walked towards the gate of the manor unhurriedly. After seeing Lucy, other servants along the way consciously stood on the side of the road to make way for her, and Lucy also smiled at them, without showing a hint of arrogance, and politely returned the gift. Look at how lucky Lucy is. She can serve His Majesty the King. Yes. And His Majesty has such a good temper. The two young servants huddled in the corner said in a jealous tone, looking at her from the corner of her eye from time to time. Looking at the back of Lucy walking. Lucy didn't hear these topics about her. Even if she heard it, she would only smile in her heart. From the moment she became Edward's maid, she began to bear the jealousy and hatred of all kinds of people. Some discussions are nothing. The sisters have long been used to it. Lucy twisted her slender waist and walked to the gate of the manor in a ladylike manner. I saw a knight in his 30s, dressed in black and white aristocratic casual clothes, stroking a black horse with his hands. The knight had long golden hair, his clothes were covered with dust, his face seemed to have been scratched with fresh blood by a branch or something, a 2-foot-long rapier hung from his waist, and he wore a pair of thick and furry cowhide boots. He also cracked a smiling face. His weather-beaten handsome face still had a hint of a smile on it. Staring closely at his mount, a black steed. This is sure that the hero knight in the romance novel is still alive. Lucy walked up to Mr. Knight with a smile and gave a lady salute. Sir, the master of my house invites you to have dinner first. He is dealing with some things now and will be there soon. Okay. Thank you for your host's invitation, but can you prepare some fodder for my little friend first? The knight asked Lucy. Lucy looked at the dusty black horse, about 5 feet tall at the shoulders, a head higher than the top of her own head. Its black sideburns fluttered with the wind, and an indescribable style fascinated people. Even though Lucy didn't know what kind of horse it was, she knew it was a good horse just by looking at its appearance, a horse no less good than Arthur. Yes. Singer, you can take this knight's horse to the stable and let the groom take good care of it, Lucy said politely to the knight, and then ordered a manservant who guarded the gate to lead the horse. Please come with me. We have prepared a sumptuous dinner for you. Lucy guided the knight to the small restaurant, where the king usually enjoys a personal lunch alone, and Edward hardly used it. He always liked this kind of reunion long table dinner. After Edward finished his dinner, he was taken to the living room by Lucy. By this time, the gray-faced knight had taken on a completely new look. The handsome knight didn't seem to be interested in taking a bath, exuding a fresh breath, which is a rare thing that someone can have in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages. As the King of England, Edward loves bathing very much, so under his leadership, the entire royal family and servants take a bath almost every week. But among the European apostles headed by the royal family members, they even regarded bathing as the root of depravity. It's touting this habit as a personal achievement. Not ashamed, but proud. It can be concluded from this that it is very rare for a woman in the Middle Ages to be raped by someone, especially for the buddies who traveled to that time, who can like noble ladies. I admire them very much. This is mainly because people at that time believed that bathing was not good for the body, and they believed that hot water would dilate the pores, making it easier for bacteria to invade the body. The nobles at that time exuded poisonous gas, and even the most beautiful and handsome faces would be defeated by the stinky smell, and in order to cover up the smell on their bodies, they needed to use a lot of face powder to cover it up. So this is what French perfume is famous for. Cause of the world. This is why Europeans at that time had such a strong interest in Asian spices, so Europeans did not take a bath at that time, and it can even be regarded as an important reason for them to open up the ocean and colonize everywhere. Therefore, Europeans embarked on a great voyage due to many factors. Unlike some historical essays, once the Chinese did not have the Ming dynasty's order to seal the sea, they would start a great voyage, colonize the world, and move to another peak from then on. The consequences of this bad habit of Europeans were the flu and plague that were prevalent in Europe at that time. According to records, under the attack of the Black Death that swept across Europe in the middle of the 14th century, the city of London, which once developed to a population of 100,000, suddenly reduced its population by 1/3. Therefore, it is more dangerous to live in a city in the Middle Ages. Until 1750, only 6% of Parisian palace houses had bathrooms. It wasn't until the late 1700s that doctors began advising people to wash their hands, face and neck every day. Since then, European talents have finally embarked on the road of hygiene with frequent bathing. Therefore, Edward saw at a glance that the wandering knight had taken a bath, and he couldn't help but have a good impression of him. Knight from afar, I wonder if I can have the honor to know your name? Of course. Your honorable baron. Edward had asked Lucy to reveal to him that he was a baron, and that he was not allowed to reveal the fact that he was a king. In fact, wandering knights are not real knights. To be precise, they should be quasi-knights. The nobles liked to recruit such wandering knights when they were fighting. Not only did they have excellent qualities, but they also prepared their own weapons and horses, which saved them a lot of money. Of course, the knights are not free. After the meritorious deeds, they will be canonized with knights. Their goal is to become a real knight with a fief, and Edward called him a knight, which is a respectful statement. My name is Grenville Richard. I am from the Richard family of the Richard Knights in Southampton. Grenville said unhurriedly. His voice had a sense of vicissitudes. If the opposite is a girl, she will definitely be confused by his handsome face and magnetic voice. However, Edward is a man. I am the eldest son of the Richard family. My family was knighted during the battle for the royal family. Since you are the eldest son, how did you become a wandering knight? Edward asked curiously. Thank you, Juan Shu Iao, NRPHF 5. Are you kidding me? Lancaster Ku, Yuri Yefimovich Shelov, Cheyenne Wa Ishindio, Lily 599, Hanma, Zinghayu, Ice Zai, Master Fan spans Aurora for 3,000 years. There is nothing wrong with ignorance. Why are there so many voters today? Do you feel so happy? Also, I have already signed a contract, so everyone will smash me to death with money. Your support is my best effort. Chapter 24 Arrangements. The reason why I decided to wander is because my father is not young. I don't know when he will be called by the Lord and leave me. And I have always wanted to see the world outside of Southamptonshire. So I choose to come out now. Grenville sighed, and then his eyes lit up again. I plan to spend the next 3 years wandering around England to learn a lot, and then go back to my hometown to inherit my father's fiefdom. Edward did not expect that there was such a donkey friend in the Middle Ages, but the current appearance is a bit too shabby. Grenville, who had taken a shower, changed into a piece of clothing, and he looked heroic and extremely masculine. It's just that the cuffs that have exposed small holes have already betrayed his current embarrassment. Mr. Knight, what are you doing now? Edward pointed out a little embarrassedly, and could only remind him gently up. How should I put it? Grenville seemed to know his current embarrassing situation. There are always some guys in England who like to ask for nothing. What about your entourage? Edward then asked. Of course. There are still some guys in England who like to rob if they can't get it. Grenville shrugged helplessly, showing a smile that you understand. Sir, you have a great sense of humor. Really? I don't think I'm a humorous person. On the contrary, I feel I'm a lonely person. Grenville said self-deprecatingly, with a slight mocking smile on the corner of his mouth. Edward didn't know how to proceed, but his coping level and speaking order were pretty good, unlike uneducated people. Moreover, the palms of both hands had a thick layer of calluses, and the inner surface of the thumb was also calloused. The strangulation marks were very obvious, which was caused by long-term bowing. He should be a person from the knight class. For a long time, people have had few opportunities for education, and there are only 2 universities in England, Oxford University and Cambridge University, and William Thomas at the time described the university this way: the children of humble birth are sent to learn to acquire the knowledge on which they live. This person is the favorite of Henry VIII. It can be seen from his remarks that the status of university education in Britain at that time can be seen, so the Middle Ages can be imagined. During the Middle Ages, the education tradition of the British aristocracy still inherited knight education, and the training content was mainly military skills, with a lack of book knowledge. The children of nobles also generally pay more attention to fighting and killing than reading, writing and writing. And a knight with a bit of culture like Grenville is usually the existence of horns and scales. Throughout the Middle Ages, the British aristocracy and gentry class despised education, and they couldn't even write their names. And even in the period of Henry VIII and the Tudor dynasty, not many squires had gone to school. In the period of Elizabeth I, there were still aristocrats in the Privy Council who could not sign their names on official documents. In the 16th century, British society began to transform, slowly transforming from a feudal economy to a capitalist economy. Some gentry adapted to the society at that time, were able to enter the House of Commons, and their political status was improved. The original knight education could not face this transformation at that time. Not only was the demand for knowledge from overseas colonization, but also influenced by the Renaissance, cultural knowledge began to be secularized, and the nobles realized that the bigger ones with knowledge were higher. There were also various worthy reasons at this time. England's aristocratic education method was transformed, and more children of nobles and squires were sent to college. In fact, It was the rise of university education in Britain that created the foundation for Britain to maintain its huge colonial rule and played an important role in making Britain a maritime power. Britain said, "Although I started late, I ran fast, Your Excellency the Baron. I still don't know which great family you come from?" Grenville looked at Edward curiously and asked politely. He must come from a big and prestigious family, and he spoke clearly at such a young age, with a trace of a superior in his tone. He must be a big man, Grenville couldn't help guessing in his heart. "Oh, it's nothing, I just belong to tutor with His Majesty the King, and my family is just a branch." Edward lied without stammering, and there was no hint of trace in his tone. Tremolo and tension. Even though it was expected that Edward's background was very strong, he could still feel the weight of his power and status in Edward's understatement. "Oh, God. So Baron, you come from the great Tudor royal family. Please forgive me for being rude." Grenville's tone was already full of respect and trembling. Obviously, this news gave him a lot of stimulation. "Oh my God. What did I see? A member of the royal family." Edward's false identity made Grenville's breathing tense. The status of the Edwardian branch is not important, but in England it is different. It is well known that the current King Edward VI is very weak and may die prematurely at this time. His branch status may have a great advantage in the competition for the throne. After all, in England, a conservative country, female succession to the throne is an unacceptable thing for those conservative nobles, which is the result of helplessness when they have no choice. If he fights for his breath, it might be impossible for him to sit on that coveted throne. "Forget it, it's none of my business, I'm just a passerby." Grenville shook his long hair that was not completely dry, and smiled wryly in his heart, with a surprised expression on the surface. The thought in Grenville's mind was only for a moment, and only he knew it, and Edward naturally couldn't know it. However, Edward is also aware of his body. With the increase of daily activities, coupled with Edward's self-exercise, eating beef and venison every day, he gradually improved a lot. However, the long-standing impression in people's minds cannot be changed. "Mr. Knight, take a rest first. I see that you are quite tired." Edward saw that his face was a little pale, and then he waved to Lucy, who was waiting by the side. "Lucy, clean up a guest room for Richard Knight, Mr. "Richard. My maid will clean up a guest room for you to rest in." Edward turned his head and said to Grenville, "Thank you for your arrangement, Your Excellency the Baron." Grenville's tone was much more respectful than when he came. "I think your kindness will spread throughout England." Is he implying that he will give me free publicity? Haha, whatever, there is no such person anyway. "Thank you, Juan Shu Iao." "Just kidding. His people are 1,111, Yulia Efimowicz Shelov, Minhang Menghua, Cheyenne Wa Ishindeo, Lily 599, a lot of votes to support everyone. Chapter 25 Arthur and number 039, S disadvantage. Edward waited until Grenville was taken away by Lucy, then got up and went to the study, and continued to read his original work on ethics. Nothing to say all night. On the second day, under the service of Lucy and Luna, Edward got dressed in complicated clothes. After breakfast, Edward came to the stable, and at this time Arthur was already snorting and stomping on a small door. After seeing Edward, Arthur became even more excited and stomped on the door a lot harder. Edward is also a horse lover, especially when he crossed here before he was 20 years old in his previous life. To be honest, he has never even touched a woman's second base, let alone actual combat. So in this world, you can raise a pony and ride a steed that even billionaires in the 21st century have no chance. That's a cool word. Edward's love for Arthur came from the heart. Seeing Arthur tormenting the small door with a series of kicks, Edward came to Arthur's threshold. Regardless of the groom's dissuasion, he stroked Arthur's white mane with his hands, and the mane felt a little soft in his hand, a little soft and hard, and a little pimple under Edward's caress. Arthur's clever eyes revealed a look of joy, and he kicked even more happily. "Wonderful child. If you kick it badly, you will pay for it." Edward casually put his hand on Arthur's long ear. It was fleshy, and with the arrival of summer, its hair had already shed a lot. The whole ear is full of flesh color, which looks very cute. After opening the fence, Arthur stuck out his tongue happily and showed off his cuteness in front of Edward. Unfortunately, it was only winking at the blind man. Edward was not attracted by it at all. He's a beauty lover, so you will only be attracted by beautiful women. "Hey, have you fed him fodder?" Yes, Your Majesty, I also fed Arthur 3 eggs today." Edward asked the groom suddenly, and he couldn't help being stunned. After a while, it wasn't until he realized that he probably didn't expect His Majesty the King to ask him such a lowly servant question, So he watched Edward reply nervously. Raising horses is tiring work. Horse is an animal of the genus Equus. There is a folk legend that a horse will not be fat if it does not eat night grass. Therefore, the groom often has to get up in the middle of the night to feed the horses, and also asks the groom to carefully feed them with soaked bean cakes, soybean meal, and cornmeal water. In summer, it is necessary to watch the trough for feeding. Only by constantly staring can you grasp the amount of feed. After eating, you must clean the trough to avoid spoilage. It is also necessary to let the horse drink water in time, and must drink clean water, and drink warm water in winter. Therefore, the grooms not only have to fetch clean water at any time, but also boil water to serve these ancestors. Of course, since there is bitterness, there is sweetness. If you are a groom, you not only receive a higher salary than ordinary servants every month, but you can often see kings and princesses. The most heartwarming thing is that he takes care of the feed for the horses, and when feeding them, he can secretly taste a little. Yes, that's right, people don't eat as well as horses at that time. Ordinary people ate some black bread made of rye, and conscientious merchants usually only added a little wood chips and stones, which was very fair. And those horses, especially the war horses, usually only eat oats, and occasionally add some eggs and meat. In this era of poor living materials, eating oats and a bite of eggs from time to time, even nobles are no different. Edward led Arthur to the racecourse. Along the way, Arthur was very well behaved and sensible, without a trace of the usual mischievousness, which made Edward couldn't stop being surprised. It wasn't until later that Edward found out that the big black horse in Grenville lived next to Arthur at night. It seemed that Arthur was dissatisfied with having an outsider as his neighbor and was going to pretend to be forced. However, according to Edward's usual understanding of Arthur, 9 out of 10 this guy is jealous of a horse that looks better than him, otherwise why wouldn't he see him macing with William's horse next door? The knight and the groom explained it to Edward in detail later. It is said that on that dark and windy night, Arthur kicked the wooden wall of the big black horse first, and raised the horse's lips in embarrassment. Wow! Call. It was particularly loud in the quiet night. Arthur looked at the big black horse with complacent eyes, and there was indescribable pride in his eyes. Who knew that the big black horse was eating the supper fed by the groom, silently not speaking, leaving Arthur with a big dark back. Oh. No, it's a big butt. They don't even look at Arthur, just quietly being a handsome man. The attitude of the big black horse annoyed Arthur, who has always been arrogant. Since it was adopted by Edward, it has always been the second-ranked horse in the royal family's horse herd, except for the old horse that was loved by Henry VIII. Other than Arthur's father, it is a domineering character. Suddenly one day, a black horse from outside was so big on it, which deeply stimulated Arthur's sensitive heart, so Arthur released a shocking nirvana. I saw Arthur swaggering to the wooden wall next to the two horses, pouted his little white buttocks, brewed his emotions, and released his nirvana. Fart. The poor big black horse just quietly ate his supper, not wanting to be in trouble. A loud noise almost choked it, and it took a while to breathe. The smell was a little sour, and the sour was a little spicy. The gas rushed towards my face, and I had the idea of choking it to death. It looked up, and only Arthur was screaming, and it seemed that this little white guy did it, and the big black horse couldn't help thinking, especially seeing Arthur's expression, its anger has already rushed into its brain, and it has entered the runaway mode. Back then, Master Benma followed his master all over the world, and when he met a robber, he dared to kick him until he couldn't take care of himself. How dare you, an immature pony, make waves in front of Master Ma? It seems that it's time to teach you a lesson. The big black horse had already regarded Arthur as the chicken that killed the chicken to show the monkey. The big black horse glanced at the railing about 4 feet in front of it, glanced at it with disdain, jumped up abruptly, and crossed the railing at a speed of 10 meters per second. The smug little pony stared at him with the same smug expression on his face. It was very funny to watch the big black horse jump over the fence that he hated. I saw the big black horse imitating Arthur's steps, swaggering and twisting its big buttocks, grinning happily. Suddenly the little pony had an ominous premonition. Sure enough, the big black horse, in its own way, treated its own body, posing like Arthur, put its big butt on the guardrail, and smiled back. Arthur saw that it was better than having nothing to eat for 3 days' discomfort to eat. The big black butt pouted loud "Gow," and fired a hollow bullet in Arthur's direction. Puff puff puff. 3 loud noises shook the little pony almost unsteadily. So, this morning, Arthur kicked the guardrail vigorously, just wanting to go out and settle accounts with a big black horse that was taken away, thanks to Han Bing Ziae, whose person is 1111, Ye Fat's Happy Life, Prussian Nobles, Book Friends Juan, for their support, especially the Prussian nobles, Hanbing's book friends 215xxxx32, everyone's big rewards. It's a pity that there are not many manuscripts saved by the second emperor, and we still have to keep it for King Ming Festival to update normally. I am so sorry. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.